She came with nothing but a name no one recognized and a ticket to the end of the line, a mail-order bride for a widowed rancher she had never met, in a town that had already decided she wouldn't last. What waited for her in Black Hollow wasn't a fresh start. It was a house held together by grief, two children who didn't want her there, a ranch one bad season away from collapse, and a man who had forgotten how to let anyone in. She had no land, no allies, no guarantee of anything. What she had was the refusal to leave. And in the end, that was enough to change everything. If this story moves you, hit like, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far it travels. And follow the channel so you never miss what comes next. The train smelled like coal smoke and other people's sweat, and Evelyn Mercer had been sitting in the same hard-backed seat for 11 hours when the conductor finally called out Black Hollow. She didn't move right away. The other passengers were already gathering their things, a cattle buyer in a too-tight jacket, a family of 5 with a baby that hadn't stopped crying since Cheyenne, an old woman who hadn't spoken a single word the entire ride, but had watched Evelyn with the kind of steady, measuring look that made her feel like a mistake waiting to happen. Evelyn let them all stand and shuffle and bump into each other before she reached beneath her seat for her travel bag. It wasn't a heavy bag. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Everything she owned in the world fit into a single worn leather satchel and a steamer trunk that had been loaded into the freight car back in St. Louis. When you lose a house, a business, a reputation, and a father, all within the span of 14 months, you find out quickly how little of what you thought you owned was ever really yours. She stood, straightened her coat, picked up the bag. You chose this, she told herself. You wrote the letter. You agreed to the terms. You got on the train. It didn't help much, but it was true, and truth was one of the few things she still trusted. Black Hollow's train platform was 3 weathered planks and a hand-painted sign that someone had nailed to a post at a slight angle, as if they'd driven the nail and then immediately lost interest in the whole project. The town beyond it was maybe 24 buildings strung along a single main road, the kind of place that looked like it had intended to become something, and then just stopped. A general store, a livery, a structure that might have been a saloon or might have been a church. It was hard to tell from a distance, and somehow that felt appropriate. Evelyn stepped off the train and stood on the platform and looked at it all. A cold October wind came down from the hills and pushed straight through her coat like it wasn't there. The sky overhead was the particular shade of gray that meant the weather hadn't decided what it was doing yet, but was thinking seriously about snow. There were 3 other people on the platform. A station master who was already walking toward the freight car, a young boy with a fishing pole who had no apparent reason to be there, and a man standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way people do when they're not sure what to do with their hands. She knew it was him before he looked up. Colt Brennan was taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd expected anything. His letter had said nothing about his height. He was lean in the way that outdoor work makes men lean, not wiry but stripped down to what's necessary, like everything extra had been used up. His face was the kind that had probably been younger looking before whatever it had been through, with dark circles under his eyes that had the settled quality of months rather than a bad night. He was maybe 35, maybe older. Grief adds years in ways that are hard to account for. He saw her looking and walked over. "Miss Mercer?" Not a question. He'd apparently had the same certainty she did about which person on the platform was which. "Mr. Brennan?" She shifted her bag to her left hand and extended her right. He shook it. His grip was firm but brief, the handshake of a man who'd agreed to something he was still making his peace with. "Train's on time," he said. "Yes." Yeah." He put his hat back on. "Wagon's out front. I'll get your trunk." She almost offered to help, and then didn't. There was something in the way he moved toward the freight car. Purposeful, contained, like a man handling the practical details of a situation so he didn't have to think about the larger shape of it, that told her help wasn't what he wanted right now. She waited on the platform and looked at Black Hollow and thought, well, here you are. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes on a road that was more suggestion than surface, rutted deep from recent rain, and not entirely recovered. Colt drove and didn't say much. Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the landscape open up around them. Rolling grassland, stands of cottonwood going gold, hills in the distance that caught the light in a way that was genuinely beautiful. If you weren't also cold and tired and sitting next to a man who clearly didn't know how to begin talking to you. She tried once. How far is the ranch? About 4 miles past the Harker Creek crossing. Is that the creek we just went over? No, that was Dillon's Run. Harker's further on. I see. Silence. She tried again. Your letter mentioned 2 children. Something shifted in his posture, almost imperceptible, a slight tightening across his shoulders. That's right. Thomas is 11. Clara's 6. Do they know I'm coming today? I told them, which wasn't the same thing as saying they knew, and they both understood that, but neither of them said so. After a while, Colt spoke without looking at her. I should tell you, the house isn't in the best shape. I've been focused on the cattle operation, and some things inside have... He paused. I should have had more time to prepare, but Roundup ran long this year. That's all right. It's not really, he said, but I appreciate you saying so. That was more honesty than she'd been expecting, and it caught her off guard enough that she didn't have a response ready. She looked at the side of his face, the jaw set, eyes on the road, and thought that whatever else this man was, he wasn't a liar. That was something. In her experience, that was more than something. Tut-tut. The Brennan Ranch came into view around a long bend in the road, and Evelyn's first thought was that it had been a fine operation once. You could see it in the bones. The main house was substantial, 2 stories with a covered porch running the length of the front, and there were 2 large outbuildings and a proper corral with good fencing. But the porch railing had a section missing, one of the outbuilding doors hung at an angle, and the kitchen garden she could see at the side of the house had gone entirely to weeds. There was a girl on the porch. She was small for 6, or maybe she just seemed small because she was standing very still and very straight in a way that children usually don't, watching the wagon come up the road with enormous dark eyes that were unsettlingly similar to her father's. She had dark hair and 2 uneven braids that someone had clearly attempted to make neat and not quite managed. No sign of the boy. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. Clara, he said, come say hello. The girl came down the porch steps carefully, one at a time, and stopped a few feet from the wagon wheel. She looked up at Evelyn with those serious eyes and said nothing. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon before Colt could come around to help her. She didn't want to make him do that, make the whole thing more formal than it needed to be. And she crouched down so she was at eye level with the child. You must be Clara. I'm Evelyn. Papa said you're going to live here now, Clara said. That's right. Do you know how to make biscuits? It was so specific and so earnest that Evelyn almost smiled. I do, yes. Clara seemed to weigh this information seriously. Hattie used to make biscuits, she said. But Hattie left after Mama died. Papa makes them sometimes, but they come out hard. Clara, Colt said from behind Evelyn, a note of tired warning in his voice. It's all right, Evelyn said without turning around. She kept her eyes on the girl. I'll do my best with the biscuits. I can't promise they'll be the same as Hattie's. That's okay, Clara said, with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has learned not to expect things to be the same as they were. You can put butter on them if they're not right. That's a very practical solution. Clara almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Behind her, Evelyn heard boots on the porch steps and turned. A boy was standing at the top of the stairs, 11 years old, with the same dark coloring as his father and sister, but something harder already settled in his face. He was looking at Evelyn with an expression she recognized from her own mirror at certain low points. The expression of someone deciding in advance that whatever this is, it's going to go badly. Thomas, Colt said. Come down. I can see fine from here, Thomas said. A beat of silence. Colt's jaw tightened slightly. He looked like a man choosing a hill not to die on. All right, he said. Thomas stared at Evelyn from the top of the stairs with his arms crossed, and Evelyn looked back at him and didn't pretend the moment was something other than what it was. Hello, Thomas, she said. He said nothing. She nodded once, acknowledging it, not fighting it, and turned back to help with the trunk. The inside of the house was worse than outside, and outside hadn't been good. It wasn't dirty exactly. The floors had been swept, the dishes stacked, but there was a particular quality to a space where someone has been maintaining the minimum and no more. and it had settled into every corner of the Brennan house like a kind of dust you couldn't sweep out. The curtains were faded, and one had a long tear that had been left unrepaired. The kitchen table had a crack running through one leg that had been propped with a folded piece of leather. On the mantel above the fireplace, there was a framed photograph of a woman, dark-haired, serious, striking in the particular way that photographs from that era captured people, slightly formal, slightly exposed. And around it, the mantel was bare in the way that spoke of other things having been there once and removed or lost. Colt carried her trunk upstairs without comment and showed her to a room at the end of the hall. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the side yard. Someone had put a small bunch of dried flowers in a jar on the windowsill, and looking at it, Evelyn realized it had been there long enough to fade and curl at the edges, not put there recently for her, but not thrown away either. "It's not much," Colt said from the doorway. "It's fine," Evelyn said. He nodded. "Supper's at 6. I eat with the children." He paused. "I mean, you'll eat with us. That's—" He stopped. 6 o'clock. "I'll be down at 6, she said. He left. She heard his boots going back down the hall and then the stairs, and then the house was quiet except for the wind outside and the distant sound of one of the cattle somewhere, complaining about something. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She was 31 years old. She had grown up in a comfortable house in Cincinnati with a father who'd owned a dry goods business and a mother who'd died when she was 9, and a series of tutors and then a finishing school, and then a brief and disastrous near engagement to a man who had turned out to have several significant character flaws that weren't apparent until fairly deep into the acquaintance. After that, she'd worked as a bookkeeper for her father's business, which was how she'd come to know, in the months before his death, that the business was failing, had been failing for years, and that the debts he'd quietly accumulated were, in the technical sense, hers now. She'd sold what could be sold, paid what could be paid. And when it was done, she'd been left with a boarding house room in a city where everyone knew the Mercer name in the wrong way, no prospects, and the stubborn, quiet refusal to simply wait for something to happen to her. The advertisement had been in the back of a magazine, the kind of thing she'd never have looked at twice in different circumstances. Widower, 35, 2 children, working ranch in Wyoming Territory, seeks capable woman of good character, willing to build a life in an honest place. She'd read it 3 times and then looked out the window of her boarding house room at the brick wall across the alley and thought, well, what exactly are you waiting for? She'd written the letter. Colt had written back. Careful, plain-spoken letters that said what they meant and didn't dress it up. He'd been honest about the state of the ranch, about the children, about what he was asking for and what he was offering. He hadn't pretended it was anything other than a practical arrangement between 2 people who needed the same thing. She'd appreciated that. She was still appreciating it. She was also sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a cold room in Wyoming Territory, listening to wind she wasn't yet familiar with, and wondering what she'd actually gotten herself into. Same thing you always do, she thought. Exactly as much as you can handle. Possibly slightly more. She stood up, unpacked what she needed for the night, and went downstairs to see about supper. The kitchen was the largest room in the house, as it should be in a working ranch, and it had clearly been the center of things once. Big iron stove, wide table, shelves running along 2 walls with enough cookware for a serious operation. But the shelves were half empty now, and the stove had a layer of grease built up around the burners that suggested someone had been cooking on it without cleaning it, which was how you ended up with fires at inconvenient moments. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table doing something with a piece of string, making patterns between her fingers with the focused determination of a child who has invented her own entertainment. She looked up when Evelyn came in. "Papa's in the barn," she said. "He said supper's salt pork and beans." "That sounds all right," Evelyn said. "Would you mind if I looked around the kitchen, just to get familiar with where things are?" Clara shrugged with the loose-shouldered indifference that was essentially permission and went back to her string. Evelyn opened the pantry. Salt pork, dried beans, some flour, a tin of molasses, cornmeal, potatoes in a bin, half of them going soft, dried apples. Remarkably little else. She looked at what was there and thought about what could be made from it that was better than salt pork and beans, and then she thought about the fact that she was a stranger in this kitchen, And this was the first night, and maybe this wasn't the moment to start making changes. She started the beans. While they soaked, she cleaned the stove properly with a rag and some ash, because a dirty stove was a fire waiting for the right moment, and that was purely practical, nothing to do with making any kind of statement. Thomas came in while she was doing it and stopped short. "What are you doing?" he said. "Cleaning the stove." "That's not—" He stopped. "Papa does that." "It was getting a little built up," Evelyn said mildly. "I didn't want the grease to catch. I'll have it done before I start cooking." Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, and she could feel him looking at her back, working out what he wanted to say to that. In the end, he said nothing. She heard him go to the table and sit down, pulling out a chair with more force than necessary. "Thomas," Clara said, "she knows how to make biscuits." "I don't care," Thomas said. "You like biscuits." "I don't care, Clara." Evelyn finished with the stove and washed her hands and started the salt pork. The kitchen filled with the smell of something actually cooking, and the tension in the room shifted slightly. Not gone, not even close to gone, but altered. Hunger was a great leveler. She'd learned that early. When Colt came in from the barn 40 minutes later, supper was on the table, salt pork and beans as promised, and also cornbread because the flour was there and the children were clearly not getting enough in the way of bread, and a pot of coffee that she'd kept hot on the back of the stove. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. Then at her. Something passed across his face that wasn't quite an expression, more like a door opening an inch and then being pulled back. "You didn't have to." "It's the same ingredients," Evelyn said. "Just organized differently." He sat down. The children sat. Evelyn sat. There was a moment where nobody moved, the four of them at the table like a tableau of a family that wasn't one, and then Colt reached for the cornbread, and the spell broke. Thomas ate without speaking. Clara ate with a small running commentary about various things, apparently for no particular audience. A horse she'd seen that morning, a bird that had been on the fence, the string pattern she'd been trying to work out. Colt answered her when she addressed him directly, and otherwise ate steadily, the way men eat when they're genuinely hungry and not putting on a show about it. Evelyn ate and listened and said little and watched. After supper, when the dishes were done and the children had gone upstairs, Colt poured 2 cups of coffee and put one in front of her and sat back down at the kitchen table. "We should probably talk," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He turned his cup in his hands. "I want to be straight with you about where things stand." "I'd prefer that." "The ranch is in trouble." He said it plainly, without apology or qualification. "I've got 200 head of cattle, but last spring's calf crop was poor. Sickness went through in March, and I lost 30 calves before I knew what was happening. The note on the property is current, but barely. I've got maybe enough to get through winter if nothing goes wrong." He paused. "Things tend to go wrong." "What do you need from me?" Evelyn asked. "Specifically." "Not in general." "Specifically." He looked at her. The question had surprised him. She could tell. "I need the house managed," he said. "I can't do that. And the cattle both. I need the children, particularly Clara, to have someone consistent. Thomas is—" He stopped. "Thomas is handling his mother's death in his own way, and I haven't figured out the right way to help him with it. Clara needs more than I can give her right now." He looked at his coffee. "And I need somebody who won't leave the first time it gets hard." "How long has it been?" Evelyn asked. "Since your wife passed." 14 months. She nodded. That was enough time to stop expecting the worst of every day, and not nearly enough time to stop feeling it. "I won't leave because it's hard," she said. "That's not a guarantee against everything, but it's what I can tell you tonight." He looked at her for a moment, measuring, careful, the look of a man who had been burned on optimism before. "That's fair," he said. They sat with that for a moment. The fire popped. Wind pushed against the window. "What about you?" he said. "What do you need?" It was an unexpected question, and the fact that he asked it, that it had occurred to him to ask it, told her something she filed away carefully. "A place that's actually mine to be in," she said. "Not borrowed, not temporary." She looked at him. "And honesty. I'd rather know when something's wrong than have it managed around me." He nodded once, slowly. "I can do that." "Then I think we have a starting point," Evelyn said. "It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise of something easy. It was just two people at a kitchen table in a cold house at the edge of nothing, agreeing to try. She woke at 4:30 the next morning from a habit she'd had since her boarding house days. Cheap walls, early risers, the sleep never quite settled. She lay for a moment listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the creak of the building against wind, something dripping somewhere it shouldn't be, and from downstairs the muffled sound of someone already moving around in the kitchen. She dressed and went down. Colt was at the stove trying to make coffee and reading something at the same time, a letter by the look of it. He heard her on the stairs and turned. "You don't have to be up," he said. "I was awake." She came into the kitchen and looked at the stove, where the coffee was in danger of boiling over because he was reading and not watching it. She moved the pot before it did. He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket and didn't offer any explanation, and she didn't ask for one. She made actual coffee, proper, not just hot water pushed through the grounds until it gave up. And they drank it in the gray pre-dawn while he read his ledger, and she looked at the kitchen and made a mental inventory of what was here and what was missing and what could be done with it. It was the same thing she'd done with her father's business books. In the end, figure out what you actually have before you start making plans. Outside, it was beginning to get light. "I'll need to understand the finances," she said. He looked up from the ledger. "Why?" "Because you told me last night that the ranch is in trouble, and if I'm going to help, I need to understand what kind of trouble, not just in general terms. What's owed, what's coming in, what the margins look like." She held his gaze. "I kept books for my father's business for 6 years. I'm not asking to take over. I'm asking to understand." A long pause. He looked back at his ledger, then back at her. "All right," he said. "After the morning chores?" Aman. The morning chores turned out to be substantial. She hadn't expected otherwise, but the scope of what one man was managing alone became clear as the day progressed. Cattle to check, horses to feed and water, a fence line in the lower pasture that needed mending before it failed entirely, and a wagon wheel that had cracked on yesterday's trip to town and was going to need to be replaced before the next supply run. And that was just the outside. Inside, there were 2 children to get fed and, in Thomas's case, badgered into completing the half-page of arithmetic that passed for his schoolwork. She managed the inside. It was a strange word for it, managed, but it was accurate. She fed the children in heated water and got Thomas to the arithmetic eventually through the simple technique of sitting across the table from him and not going anywhere until he started. He glared at her the entire time. She looked at her hands folded on the table and waited him out. "You're not my mother," he said at one point. Flat, factual, a statement, not an accusation. "No," she said. "I know that. So you can't make me do anything." She thought about this honestly. "I can't make you do anything," she agreed. "But you're going to sit here until you do the arithmetic, and I can sit here longer than you can resist it. That's not about authority. That's just about time." He stared at her. She waited. He picked up his pencil. The ledger meeting happened after the noon meal, with Clara napping on the settle in the front room and Thomas outside somewhere with what appeared to be a rock collection he was taking very seriously. Colt spread the ranch ledger on the kitchen table, and Evelyn looked at it. It took her about 10 minutes to understand the shape of things, which was roughly the same amount of time it had taken her with her father's books. And the sick, familiar feeling in her stomach was about the same too. It wasn't disaster, not yet, but it was the kind of situation that disaster was already planning its visit to. The cattle note was current, as he'd said, but the note on the property itself, taken out when the ranch was established 15 years ago, had been refinanced twice, most recently 18 months prior, at terms that were unfavorable even by the standards of frontier lending. The monthly payment was manageable in a good year. This had not been a good year. The calf losses in spring had cut into the expected income from summer beef sales, and the remaining income from the fall roundup wasn't going to cover the winter operating costs, plus the note payment, plus anything that went wrong. And something always went wrong. "Who holds the note?" she asked. "Bank in town. Harlan Graves owns it. He owns about half the notes in this valley." Something in his voice when he said the name. "You don't like him." "He's been fair enough," Colt said, which was a careful way of saying several other things. "But," he was quiet for a moment. "He made an offer on the northern pasture last spring, after Margaret died." Said it would ease the burden. He paused. It would have, in the short term. But that pasture is where the spring water is. Sell that, and the whole operation becomes unviable within 3 years. And you said no. I said no. And now he holds the note and he's patient, Evelyn said. Colt looked at her steadily. Something like that. She looked back at the ledger. Numbers were numbers. They didn't lie, and they didn't sugarcoat, and they didn't tell you it was going to be all right when it wasn't, which was why she'd always trusted them more than most things. The Delaney operation, she said, pointing to a line. What's that? Neighboring ranch. Old Pete Delaney's been running it since before I was born. He's got water rights on the creek that we share. Every year we come to an informal arrangement about usage. There's no formal agreement? That's just how it's done here. She thought about that. It might be worth formalizing, she said. If the arrangement's good for both sides, a written agreement protects you both. He frowned slightly. Pete's not going to think I don't trust him. It's not about trust, she said. It's about what happens if Pete dies and someone else takes over the Delaney operation. An informal arrangement dies with him. A formal one doesn't. A long pause. She could see him working through it, the resistance and then the logic of it, and then something settling. I hadn't thought about it that way, he said. You've been thinking about keeping the cattle alive and the children fed, she said. That's not a criticism. That's just what you've had to think about. He looked at her. That same measuring look, but something different in it now, something not quite wariness. She didn't name it. Too early for naming things. I'll think about the Delaney agreement, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. Thomas came back in at 3 p.m. with dirt on his boots and his rock collection in a canvas bag and stopped short in the kitchen doorway, apparently having expected to find it empty. Evelyn was mending the curtain with the long tear. She'd found thread and a needle in a box in the second kitchen drawer, and she was doing it at the kitchen table, plain and practical. Thomas stared at her. That's Mama's curtain, he said. I know, she said. She'd found the initials worked into the hem. Small, M.B., Margaret Brennan, done in the same thread but brighter once before the fabric faded around it. I didn't want to throw it out when it could still be mended. A long, complicated silence. She sewed those herself, Thomas said, when they first moved here. Then it's worth keeping, Evelyn said. She kept her eyes on the work. I'm not removing things. I'm not changing things that don't need changing. I'm just mending what's torn. She heard him breathe. In, out. The unsteady breathing of an 11-year-old trying to hold something together. You're going to change everything anyway, he said. That's what you're here for. I'm here to help, she said. Not replace. Same thing, he said, and left. And she heard his boots on the stairs and the sound of his door, and then nothing. She looked at the needle in her hand, the curtain in her lap. It's not the same thing, she thought. But you won't know that until you know it, and nothing I say will get us there faster. She went back to the mending. By the end of the first week, the shape of things had become clearer, and the shape of things was this. The house was in need of significant work. The ranch finances were precarious in the specific way that required both immediate management and longer-term planning. The younger child was cautiously warming to her, and the older child had decided that hostility was an appropriate response to grief and was pursuing it consistently. And Colt Brennan she didn't have a clean word for it. He wasn't warm, he wasn't cold. He was someone managing an enormous amount of weight who had agreed to add her to the load and wasn't sure yet whether that was going to help or make it worse. He was honest with her about the ranch. He was careful with the children. He worked from before dawn until after dark and didn't complain about it, which wasn't virtue exactly. It was more like he'd stopped expecting there to be a version of things that was comfortable. She found, as the week went on, that she was less scared than she'd expected to be. Not unscared, but less. The incident that marked the real beginning of everything happened on a Wednesday, 8 days after she arrived. She was in the barn looking for extra rope. There was a gate latch that had given out on the lower corral, and she was trying to rig a temporary fix before Colt came in from the northern pasture, when she heard raised voices outside. She came to the barn door. 2 men on horseback stopped in front of the house. Not ranch hands. They were too well dressed for ranch hands. their horses too well kept. And standing on the porch steps was Thomas, who had clearly tried to send them away and hadn't succeeded, and whose posture was the tight, controlled posture of someone frightened and not showing it. Evelyn walked out of the barn toward the house. One of the men, heavy set, in a coat that had cost more than the Brennans' entire pantry, turned his horse slightly as she approached. "Ma'am," he said, with a pleasant smile that didn't touch his eyes, "we're looking for Colt Brennan." "He's not here," Evelyn said. She came to the bottom of the porch steps and stood next to Thomas without making it a gesture, just stood there. "When do you expect him back?" "I'm not certain. Can I ask what this is regarding?" The man's smile stayed pleasant. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Harlan Graves. There's a matter of the quarterly payment that was due last Friday." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I wasn't aware the payment was past due." "It's only a few days," the man said, still pleasant, in the way that very unpleasant things are sometimes presented. "Mr. Graves is patient. He just wanted to make sure Mr. Brennan was aware of the situation." "I'll let him know you came," Evelyn said. "Thank you for the ride out." A beat. The man with the pleasant smile looked at her, and she looked back, and she did not move. "Of course," he said. He touched his hat. The two of them turned their horses and rode back toward the road. Thomas was quiet beside her until they were out of sight. Then he said, "You never sent anyone out before?" "No," Evelyn said. "Papa's going to be angry you talked to them." "He might be," she said. "That's fair." Thomas looked up at her. There was something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, not trust, but a kind of reassessment, like someone revising a number they'd been too sure of. "Were you scared of them?" he asked. She thought about honesty versus what a child needed to hear and decided they were the same thing. "Yes," she said. "A little." He looked at the road where the men had gone. "Me too," he said. And they stood there on the porch steps for a moment. Not family, not friends, just two people who had been scared of the same thing at the same time. And that was, in its small and fragile way, a beginning. Colt came back from the northern pasture at dusk, and Evelyn told him about the men from Graves's bank before he'd even gotten his coat off. She did it in the kitchen, directly, while he was still standing and she was at the stove, because she'd found in her life that bad news delivered while people were moving tended to land better than bad news delivered while they were sitting and therefore trapped by it. She told him what they'd said, what she'd said back, and she didn't editorialize. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. "The payment went out Friday morning," he said. "I wrote it to town myself." "Then there may be a miscommunication at the bank," Evelyn said. "Or Graves sent them anyway." She looked at him. He was looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, his jaw set, and she recognized the expression now. It was the one he wore when he was very angry and keeping it very controlled. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Nothing tonight." He finally moved, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "I'll ride in tomorrow and get the receipt sorted out." "I can come with you." He looked at her then, and she could see him working out whether that was a complication or a help. "All right," he said. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd heard some of it, probably all of it, given how still he'd been on the stairs for the last minute. He looked at his father and then at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't read completely, and then he said, "She talked to them when they came. She didn't let them in the house." Colt looked at Evelyn. "I just told them you'd be made aware," she said. "Nothing complicated." Something shifted in Colt's face. Not gratitude exactly, but something in that direction, tempered by the fact that he wasn't a man who expressed things easily. "Good," he said. Thomas disappeared back up the stairs. Evelyn turned back to the stove, and in the quiet of the kitchen, with supper heating and the wind picking up outside again, the particular arrangement of the Brennan household shifted by some small and not yet nameable degree. The ride into Black Hollow the next morning took 40 minutes, and they spent most of it talking about things that weren't the bank. She asked about the land, how much, how it was divided, what the northern pasture produced in a good year versus a poor one. He answered in the careful, factual way he had, and she listened the way she'd always listened to her father's business contacts, not just for what was being said, but for what the person thought was obvious and therefore didn't say, because that was usually where the important things lived. What she gathered was this: The Brennan Ranch was genuinely good land, well situated, with access to water that neighboring operations envied. The problem wasn't the land. The problem was that the person running it had been operating in crisis mode for over a year, making decisions to survive the month rather than decisions to build the year, which was understandable and also how ranches slid quietly into ruin. The Delaney water arrangement, she said, somewhere around mile 3. Did you think any more about formalizing it? I mentioned it to Pete day before yesterday. He wasn't opposed. Colt kept his eyes on the road. He seemed surprised anyone would bother making it official. Said we've had the same agreement for 12 years without paper. What did you tell him? I told him I had a wife with a bookkeeping background who thought it was a reasonable precaution. A beat. He said that sounded like sense. Evelyn smiled at the road ahead and didn't make anything of it. The bank in Black Hollow was a low wooden building between the assayer's office and a hardware store, with Harlan Graves' name painted in careful letters above the door. Inside, it smelled like old paper and coal oil. The teller was a young man with nervous hands who brightened visibly when he saw Colt and then seemed to remember something that made him less bright. Mr. Brennan? Mrs. Brennan. He'd presumably been told she existed. He looked at Evelyn like he wasn't sure what to do with her presence. She smiled pleasantly and said nothing. Colt put his payment receipt on the counter. I had 2 of your men at my ranch yesterday telling me the quarterly was past due, he said. I paid it Friday. The teller looked at the receipt, looked at it again. Let me check the ledger. He disappeared through a door. They waited. Through the interior wall, Evelyn could hear voices. The teller's, and another voice that was quieter and that she thought she would know when she heard it again. The teller came back. I apologize, Mr. Brennan. The payment was applied incorrectly. It's been corrected. And the men you sent out, Colt said, I believe there was a miscommunication. Mr. Graves sends his apologies for any concern caused. They both knew what kind of apology that was. But there was nothing to do with it except take it and leave, which was what Colt did, and Evelyn followed. Outside on the boardwalk, Colt stopped and let out a slow breath. He's watching, he said quietly, to see if I'm going to miss one. I know, Evelyn said. He looked at her. I don't want you to think, this is manageable. It's not something you need to... Colt, she said, and he stopped. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both registered it. I looked at your ledger. I know what's manageable and what isn't. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'd prefer if you didn't either. A pause. He looked out at the street where 2 men were loading a wagon in front of the feed store, and a dog was doing something extremely focused with a piece of rope. All right, he said. We need to talk about the spring cattle plan when we get back, she said. I have some thoughts. You have some thoughts, he said, not sarcastically. More like someone discovering an unexpected room in a house they thought they knew the layout of. Several, she said. Some of them might even be useful. Something crossed his face. Not a smile, not quite, but in the vicinity. Back at the ranch, the week moved into its rhythms. There were rhythms now, which was different from the first days. Evelyn was up before dawn, had coffee made when Colt came in from the first morning check, had breakfast on the table when the children came down. After breakfast, Thomas did his schoolwork, and Clara followed Evelyn around the house with the concentrated attachment of a child who has found something reliable and isn't letting go of it. This was its own kind of pressure, being the thing someone small was depending on, but it was a pressure she found she could work with. Clara was not a difficult child. She was serious and observant and occasionally made pronouncements about the world that were striking for their accuracy. Mrs. Prentice at the store said you came from the East, Clara said one morning, while Evelyn was teaching her how to roll pie crust. That's right, Cincinnati, Ohio. Is it nice there? Evelyn thought about Cincinnati. The street she knew, the house she'd sold, the faces that had looked at her differently after everything fell apart. It has nice parts, she said honestly, but I didn't want to stay. Because of us? Partly. She showed Clara how to use the rolling pin without bearing down too hard. Partly because I needed something different. Clara considered this while working her small hands on the dough. Thomas says you came because you had no place else to go. Evelyn's hand stilled for just a moment. Then she kept rolling. Thomas is partly right, she said. He says that a lot, Clara said. That he's right? No, that you only came because you had no place else. Evelyn looked at the little girl's bent head, the uneven braids she'd learned to do herself because nobody had had time to do them for her. What do you think? She asked. Clara shrugged. I think people can have more than one reason for things. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. That's a very wise observation, she said. Clara brightened. Papa says I'm pragmatic. Your papa's right, Malta. The pie crust lesson happened on a Thursday. On Saturday, the first real crisis arrived, and it didn't knock. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden. The weeds had given ground grudgingly over 2 weeks of consistent work, and there were now actual rows visible where there had been chaos. When she heard the horses coming up the road, not the slow, measured walk of a ranch hand returning, but the faster, irregular sound of animals being pushed, she stood and shaded her eyes. 3 riders, coming fast, and behind them, something was wrong with the sky in the direction of the lower pasture. Not sky, smoke. She dropped her trowel and ran for the barn, not the house, because the barn was where the extra water barrels were and where the long-handled beaters were kept for just this purpose, and she did not stop to think about whether this was her place to act, because the alternative was standing in the kitchen garden watching the Brennan Ranch burn. Colt was already out of the barn by the time she got there, having seen the smoke from wherever he'd been. He took in the scene in one fast sweep, the riders, the smoke, her running toward him, and started issuing directions with the clipped efficiency of someone who had dealt with grass fires before. Evelyn, get the children inside and stay there. I can help. The children? Thomas is 11. He can watch Clara for an hour. She grabbed one of the beaters without stopping. Where do you need me? A half-second pause. The kind of pause that was not about deciding whether she was capable, but about whether there was time to argue, and there wasn't. South fence line, he said. Stay back from the head of it and work the edges. Don't get in front of it. She ran. Oh, it was a grass fire, wind-driven, the kind that could take down half a county in dry autumn conditions, and that started from almost nothing. A spark from the road, a broken bottle catching light, a careless ember from a distant camp. The lower pasture was dry as paper after a summer with below-average rainfall, and the fire had gotten a head start before anyone had seen the smoke. What Evelyn found when she reached the south fence line was 3 ranch hands from the neighboring Delaney spread already working it, having seen the smoke before the Brennan hands had. Old Pete Delaney himself was there, 70 years old and still working, beating at the edge of the fire line with a ferocity that suggested he took this sort of thing personally. You Brennan's wife? He called when she reached him. Yes, she said. Know what you're doing? I'll learn fast. Pete Delaney looked at her for 1 second and then turned back to the fire. Beat the edges, not the middle. You're cutting it off, not chasing it. Work toward me, not away. She worked toward him. It was hard and hot, and her eyes watered from the smoke, and she beat the burning grass until her arms ached, and then kept beating because the alternative was worse. Beside her, one of the Delaney hands, a young man barely older than Thomas, was working just as hard and sweating just as much, and they didn't speak because there was nothing to say that wasn't already being said by the work. It took 2 hours to contain it. When it was out, truly out, checked and rechecked around the edges, Evelyn sat down in the dirt because her legs had decided to take a moment, and she was too tired to argue with them. Her coat was ruined. There were burns on the back of her right hand where a gust had pushed an ember her way, and she'd moved but not quite fast enough. Her face felt like she'd stood too close to an oven for an hour. Pete Delaney came and stood beside her. He was barely winded, which was either remarkable or infuriating or both. Good work, he said. Thank you for getting here fast, she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the charred section of pasture. Lose much? I don't know yet. I'll have to check with Colt. 3, 4 acres maybe. Could have been 30 if the wind had shifted. He looked down at her. You ever fight a grass fire before today? No. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Well, you've fought one now. Chachan. Colt found her still sitting in the dirt at the edge of the burned section, getting her breath back. He came across the pasture at a walk, having come from the northern edge of the fire where he'd been working the other side. And he looked at her and then at her hand, and then he crouched down in front of her. "Let me see," he said. She held out her hand. He took it, both of his hands, careful, and looked at the burn. It wasn't bad. She'd moved fast enough. But it was real. And it had the particular rawness of new burns that made looking at it unpleasant even when the injury was minor. "You should have stayed with the children," he said. Not angrily, more like a man pointing out a fact he knows he's already lost the argument about. "Thomas had Clara," she said. "Pete Delaney needed a fourth person on the south line." He was quiet. His hands were still holding hers, which she didn't think he'd noticed. "You knew what to do," he said. It wasn't a question. "Pete Delaney told me what to do. I just did what he said." "You knew enough to go to the south fence line." She thought about explaining and then decided not to. "Is the herd all right?" Spooked. Had to push them to the north pasture, but they're fine. He finally seemed to realize he was holding her hand and released it carefully. 3 acres burned. We'll reseed in spring. He stood. Could have been worse. That's what Pete said. Pete's usually right. He looked across the burned pasture. He and his men didn't have to come. "No," Evelyn agreed. "They did it because that's what neighbors do." Something in his face when she said that. A kind of recognition, like something he'd known once and let go of. The hand healed in 2 weeks. The burned pasture stayed black at the edges of her memory, a reminder of how quickly things here could go from stable to gone. She thought about that in the mornings sometimes, during the hour before the house woke up, and she had the kitchen to herself. Not with dread, exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who has been shown what the stakes actually are. She was 3 weeks in now, and the house had changed. Not dramatically. She wasn't the type for dramatic changes, and even if she had been, this wasn't her house to reshape, but in the small ways that accumulate into something real. The curtains were mended, the kitchen garden had rows, the stove didn't collect grease anymore, and every morning there was proper coffee and actual food, not just whatever came to hand. Clara had begun sitting on the kitchen counter while Evelyn cooked, which was technically not hygienic, and which Evelyn had stopped correcting after the second time because the child's commentary while she cooked was genuinely interesting. Clara had opinions about everything: the right way to salt water, the best order to plant spring vegetables, which of the ranch horses was most trustworthy versus which was most dramatic. "Ruby's the dramatic one," she told Evelyn one evening, swinging her feet against the cabinet doors. "She pretends her leg is hurt when she doesn't want to work." "How can you tell she's pretending?" "Because she forgets which leg." Evelyn looked at her. "How old are you?" 6.5, Clara said, with the precision of someone who has been 6 for long enough to know exactly how much of 6 is left. Thomas was harder. He was still hard. But there were moments, small, unguarded moments that he was usually quick to close off, where she could see him watching her not with hostility, but with something more complicated. She didn't push. She'd learned with the arithmetic that the only strategy that worked with Thomas Brennan was patience presented as indifference, which was essentially the technique of not making him feel watched while watching him carefully. She tutored him properly, which was more than the half-page of arithmetic had suggested was happening. His reading was strong, but his arithmetic had gaps. Not because he couldn't do it, but because the instruction had been inconsistent. She found an old geography primer in a box in the spare room and started working through it with him because geography could be made concrete, could be tied to things he already knew about land and water and how terrain worked. And Thomas responded to concrete things. He didn't thank her. That was fine. He started coming to the kitchen table on his own before she asked, and that was enough. The neighboring rancher came on a Tuesday, which she would remember later because everything that happened that week seemed to have a specific day attached to it, the kind of week where the calendar matters. His name was Rupert Voss, and he ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, a fact he was aware of and communicated through the particular ease of a man who has never had to prove his standing. He arrived with his ranch foreman and stopped in front of the house and waited to be noticed, which was itself a statement. Colt was out. Evelyn came to the porch. "Mr. Voss," she said, because she'd learned the faces by now. "Colt's in the north pasture." Can I help you? Voss looked at her the way certain men look at women who are standing in a doorway answering for an absent husband, assessing whether this was a situation worth engaging with or one to wait out. He decided to engage. I'll wait. It might be a while. Is there something I can pass along? Another assessment. Word is Brennan lost some pasture to fire last week. 3 acres, she said. We contained it. I heard Pete Delaney's men did the containing. Pete's men, Colt's hands, and myself, she said. It was a group effort. Voss seemed to find this either amusing or interesting. She couldn't tell which. There's been talk, he said, about whether Brennan can hold this operation another season, after everything. She looked at him steadily. Everything being? His wife dying, the calf losses, the fire. He said it without cruelty, but without softness either, the way someone states facts they've been considering. There are men in this valley who'd take the land off his hands for a fair price. Fair, he added, with an emphasis that suggested fairness was something he personally superintended. The ranch isn't for sale, Evelyn said. I'm not necessarily saying to Brennan. He looked at her directly now. A woman in your position, come from elsewhere starting fresh, might think practically about what staying here looks like in 3 years if the operation fails. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Voss, I appreciate you stopping by. I'll tell Colt you came. If you'd like to leave a message about something specific, I'll pass it along exactly as you stated. The foreman shifted his weight. Voss looked at her for another second, then touched his hat. Tell him Voss came by, he said. He'll know what it means. They rode out. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched them go and did not let her hand shake until they were out of sight, and then she allowed it briefly and then she stopped. She went inside and wrote down everything Voss had said, exact words, in the small notebook she'd started keeping for ranch matters. Then she went back to what she'd been doing, which was working through a problem she'd identified in the feed cost calculations, and which was not going to solve itself. She told Colt that evening, all of it, exact, from the notebook. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and listened, and his face did the thing it did when he was angry and managing it. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Voss has been trying to consolidate land in this valley for 4 years, he said finally. He's bought out 3 smaller operations. Willingly or otherwise. Depends how you define willing. He turned his cup. When the McCready place went under, Voss made an offer the week of the bank notice, before the family had time to look at other options. He watches for weakness, Evelyn said. Yes, then we don't show him any. She sat down across from him. Not because he'll be moved by the show of it, but because the men whose opinions can actually help us, Pete Delaney, the Garner brothers, whoever else has land bordering this valley, are watching to see what we do. If we hold, they'll respect it. If we scramble, they'll pity us. And pity doesn't help. Colt looked at her. When did you figure out how Ranch Valley politics works? You've been here 3 weeks. It works the same way any small community's politics works, she said. I grew up watching my father manage business relationships in a city. It's the same principles. Larger animals, same principles. Something crossed his face, that not quite smile that she was beginning to be able to identify. Larger animals, he repeated. The cattle are larger, she clarified, than my father's dry goods. I understood what you meant. October turned into November with a cold that came down from the hills and settled in for the season. Evelyn added a second quilt to Clara's bed and found an extra blanket for Thomas's room and spent an afternoon with rope and old burlap ceiling gaps in the house walls where the wind was finding its way in. Gaps that should have been sealed in September and hadn't been because September had been survival. Clara developed a cold that turned into a chest cough that turned into 2 nights of feverish misery that Evelyn sat through in the rocking chair by the little girl's bed. Because 6 years old and feverish in the middle of the night is not a situation that improves by leaving it alone. The second night, around 2 in the morning, Colt appeared in the doorway. Go to bed, he said quietly. I'll sit with her. I'm all right, Evelyn said. You've been in here since 10. She woke at 10. He leaned against the doorframe and looked at Clara, who was asleep now, the worst of the fever broken into something more manageable. Then he looked at Evelyn in the rocking chair with the quilt she'd brought from her own room, and the book she'd stopped reading 2 hours ago. You don't have to do this, he said. It wasn't criticism. It sounded almost like he was figuring something out. I know I don't have to, Evelyn said. She was scared and her temperature was 102. Sitting with her made sense. He was quiet for a moment. Margaret used to sit with her like that, when she was sick. Evelyn didn't say anything. The word Margaret in this house always had weight to it, and she'd learned not to move too quickly around it. She had this way of reading out loud, he said, still quiet, not quite looking at Evelyn. Even when Clara was asleep, just kept reading, said it didn't matter if she heard it or not, the sound was what helped. Evelyn looked at the closed book in her lap. She hadn't done that, hadn't known to. I'll try that, she said. He was quiet for a long moment, then, I appreciate it. I'm not good at saying this kind of thing. You don't have to say it. I know I don't have to, he said, using her words back at her, and it wasn't quite a joke, but it was the closest thing to one he'd managed since she arrived. She almost smiled. He almost did too. Clara made a small sound in her sleep, some dream conversation that meant nothing but was clearly very important to the dreamer. And they both looked at her, and that was that, just two people in a doorway at 2 a.m. on the same side of something without quite having gotten there on purpose. He said goodnight and went back to bed. Evelyn picked up her book and started reading out loud, quietly, to a sleeping 6-year-old, because it was the right thing to do even if she was the only one awake to know she was doing it. The financial picture sharpened through November the way trouble tends to, slowly and then all at once. Evelyn had been working through the ranch accounts with the same methodology she'd applied to her father's books. Lay everything out, don't assign cause yet, just see the shape. The shape was this. The fall beef sale had come in lower than expected because beef prices had dropped across the territory due to an oversupply from several large operations expanding simultaneously. This was not something the Brennan Ranch could control and not something that had been predictable, but it meant the winter operating margin was thinner than Colt had estimated, and thinner margins meant less room for anything unexpected. There was also a secondary issue she'd found, quieter and more concerning. The feed contracts Colt had in place for winter, arrangements with a supplier in Laramie, were priced at last year's rates, and the supplier had sent a letter, which she found in a stack of unopened correspondence on Colt's desk, indicating the rates were being revised upward by 15% effective December 1st. The letter had arrived 3 weeks ago. She put it in front of Colt at the kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon when the children were outside and there was nothing else that couldn't wait. He read it again, set it down. You found this in the correspondence stack, he said. Yes. He rubbed his hand across his face. I've been behind on the desk work. I know. She didn't make more of it than that. The question is whether we can negotiate the rate or find an alternative supplier before December 1st. There's one other supplier in range, Hartwell, out of Casper. What are their rates? I don't know, I haven't dealt with them. Would a letter do it, or would you need to go in person? He thought about it. Letter first. If they're in the range we need, they can hold product for us. I can draft the letter tonight, she said, if you want to look at it before it goes out. He looked at her, that measuring look, but different now. Less careful and more something else. How long did it take you, he said, to learn your father's business? About a year to understand it. About 3 years to be useful to it. You've been here 6 weeks. I have a head start, she said. I already understand how a business fails. I learned that part first. There was something in how she said it, not bitterly, just factually, the way you state a thing you've made your peace with, that made him look at her for a moment longer than usual. Draft the letter, he said. She drafted it that night. He read it the next morning, changed 2 words, and said it was better than what he would have written. She sent it with the Tuesday post. The response came back in 8 days. Hartwell's rates were better than the Laramie supplier's new prices. They could hold the required winter feed volume, and they could start delivery the first week of December if the contract was signed by the 15th of November. It wasn't a solution to everything. It was a solution to one thing, which was how solutions tended to arrive, one at a time, never quite fast enough, always with some new problem waiting behind them. But it was real, and it was something. And when Evelyn put the letter on the kitchen table in front of Colt, and he read it and looked up at her, there was something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not relief exactly. Something quieter and more durable than relief. The look of a man who has been doing everything alone for long enough that having someone doing something alongside him is, in itself startling. "Good," he said. "Just that." She folded the letter and put it in the ranch file and went back to the kitchen garden, where there was still work to do before the real cold came in and made it all wait until spring. She was on her knees in the dirt when Thomas came out of the house, not toward her but in her general direction, which she recognized as his version of seeking company while maintaining the option of denying it. He sat down on the fence rail a few feet away and watched her work. After a while he said, "Mrs. Prentice told her daughter that you're not going to last out the winter." Evelyn kept working. "Is that so?" "Her daughter told Jimmy Corlett, and Jimmy Corlett told me at the creek." He paused. "I told Jimmy he didn't know what he was talking about." She stopped digging, looked at him. He was looking at the fence post, not at her, with the studied disengagement of someone who has said something they meant but aren't ready to own. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. "Jimmy's an idiot." Still, another shrug. But he stayed on the fence rail, and she went back to the garden, and the afternoon went on around them with the quiet solidarity of people who have stopped needing to explain what they're doing in the same place. She thought about what it meant, this small, grudging defense from an 11-year-old boy who had decided in advance that she was a problem. It didn't mean he'd accepted her. It didn't mean the hard parts were over. It meant that somewhere in the past 6 weeks, without either of them agreeing to it, they had begun to be something to each other that didn't have a clean name yet. The sun moved lower behind the hills. The air sharpened. Winter was not a question anymore. It was a decision that had already been made by the season, and what remained was figuring out how to meet it. Evelyn worked until the light was gone. Thomas stayed on the fence rail until supper, and then he came inside and neither of them remarked on it, and that was its own kind of progress. The Hartwell feed contract arrived on a Thursday, and Colt signed it at the kitchen table with Evelyn sitting across from him and Clara drawing horses on a piece of brown paper at the other end. It was a small moment, pen on paper, a practical arrangement secured. But Evelyn had learned in the last 2 months that the small moments were the ones that actually held a life together. The large ones were just the small ones accumulated past the point where you could ignore them. She filed the contract in the ranch folder she'd established in the second desk drawer. Next to the water rights agreement she and Pete Delaney had finally gotten onto paper the previous week. 2 copies, both signed, one for each ranch. Pete had brought his own pen to the signing, which she'd found touching without entirely understanding why. December came in cold and serious, the way Wyoming winter always did, not easing into itself, but arriving with complete conviction. The first real snowfall came on a Sunday, 6 inches overnight, and Evelyn stood at the kitchen window in the gray pre-dawn and looked at the transformed landscape and felt something she couldn't immediately name. Not quite wonder. She'd seen snow plenty of times. Something more like recognition. Like the land was finally showing her its full self, and she was seeing it clearly for the first time. The ranch under snow had a different quality than the ranch in autumn. Everything that had been showing its age in October, the gap in the porch railing, the worn fence posts, the bare patches in the kitchen garden, was smoothed under white, made uniform, and what you saw instead was the structure of the thing. The bones, the outbuildings solid against the hill, the corral lines geometric in the white, the mountains behind it all, close and enormous in the way mountains only look in winter when the air is clear. It was a good ranch. Even in trouble, you could see it was a good ranch. She made coffee and started breakfast. And when Colt came in from the early check, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. Eggs, biscuits that had finally stopped coming out hard, salt pork. And then at her. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "Earlier than usual?" She shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Too quiet." He hung his coat. "You'll get used to it." "I think I already like it," she said, and meant it. And he looked at her in a way that suggested this surprised him, though she wasn't sure why it should. The trouble, when it came, arrived the way the worst trouble always does. Not as a single disaster, but as several things going wrong at the same time in a way that made each one worse than it would have been alone. It started with the cattle. 3 days into December, one of the hands, a young man named Dix, who had been with the ranch since before Margaret died, and who Evelyn had come to trust precisely because he didn't volunteer opinions unless asked, came to the house mid-morning with a look on his face that tightened something in her chest before he'd said a word. "Need to find Colt," he said. "He's at the north fence. What is it?" Dix hesitated, not because he didn't want to tell her she'd learned to read the difference, but because he was still working out what he'd seen. Found two head down in the east pasture, he said. Could be the cold, but they don't look right. She sent him for Colt and went to find the veterinary handbook she'd located in the same box as the geography primer, which had told her something about whoever had originally stocked this house. The Brennans had believed in having the information available. She flipped through it while she waited, not because she knew what to look for, but because having looked was better than not having looked. When Colt came in an hour later, his face told her it was worse than two head. 7, he said. He sat down heavily in the kitchen chair. 7 down and another 4 looking sick, and I don't know what it is. She put the handbook on the table open to the section on winter cattle illness. What are the signs? He described them. She read and cross-referenced, and he looked at her doing it with an expression that was past pride and past irritation and into something more raw, the expression of a man who is out of options and knows it and is watching someone try to find one. It could be this, she said, pointing to a passage. Respiratory illness complicated by the cold. The handbook says you need to separate the sick animals, keep them in the barn if you can, and the treatment is, she read it, turpentine oil and lard applied to the chest and keep them warm. It won't cure it, but it'll help them fight it. I know the treatment, he said. I just can't do it alone and keep the rest of the herd managed. She looked at him. Then we do it together. Evelyn. Where's Dick, Sides? Outside. And Harlan? Their other full-time hand. South pasture? So that's 4 of us. That's enough to split it. You and Dick's on the sick animals. Harlan and I manage the herd rotation. She was already reaching for her coat. He caught her arm, not to stop her, more like the gesture of someone who needs a second before the motion forward. You don't have to keep doing this, he said, taking on, I know I don't have to, she said. For the 3rd time since she'd arrived, she said it, and this time something in his face shifted at it, something that had been held back for weeks or longer. That's not why I'm doing it. He let go of her arm. All right, he said, Twats. They lost 4 animals before the illness ran its course. 4 out of a herd of 200 was not catastrophic. It was not even, by the cold mathematics of ranching, a significant loss. But in the context of a ranch already operating on margins that didn't allow for anything going wrong, it was 4 animals' worth of income they didn't have, and the cost of the turpentine treatments and the extra feed for the sick animals in the barn came off a number that had already been cut twice. Evelyn did the recalculations on a Tuesday evening after the children were in bed, spread out on the kitchen table with the ranch ledger and the winter budget she'd been updating weekly since she'd arrived. She sat with it for a long time, working the numbers different ways, and every version came out to the same place. They were going to come up short on the January note payment. Not dramatically short, but short. She could have waited until morning. She found she couldn't. She knocked on the door of the small room off the main bedroom where Colt kept his desk. Not his bedroom, careful about that. They had maintained the careful distance of 2 people being decent about an arrangement that was practical before it was anything else. And he called, "Come in," and she came in with the ledger and the paper she'd been working on and laid it in front of him without preamble. He looked at the numbers. She watched him look at them and saw the moment he reached the same conclusion she had, which was quick, because he was not a man who took long to understand what was in front of him. How short, he said. She showed him. He said nothing for a moment. Graves will know within a week of the payment date, he said. Yes. And if he knows we missed, he'll call the note, she said, or threaten to. And even if he doesn't call it immediately, he'll have grounds. And that's leverage he doesn't have right now. Colt leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. The lamp made long shadows. Outside, the wind had the particular high sound it made when the temperature was below 10 degrees. I've been thinking about something, Evelyn said. He brought his eyes down to her. The North Pasture spring, she said. Not the land, the water. Graves wants that spring. That's what the Northern Pasture offer was really about. I know. What if we use that? She sat down across from him. Not sell it, not negotiate it, but make it formally, legally part of an arrangement that benefits more than just this ranch. Something that ties enough other people to it that Graves can't move on it without taking on a fight he doesn't want. Colt was very still. What kind of arrangement? A water cooperative, she said. Formal, documented, shared water access for the smaller operations in this valley. The Delaney spread, the Garner brothers, the Whitfield place. All of them have been working on informal arrangements. Put it on paper, structure it as a mutual agreement, and suddenly that spring isn't just Brennan land worth acquiring. It's the center of a network that 5 other families depend on. Graves buying it out or forcing it into default doesn't just hurt you anymore. It hurts all of them. The silence in the room was the particular silence of someone thinking hard. He stopped. That's not a small thing to set up. No, she agreed. It's not. The other ranchers would have to agree. I know. And some of them won't want to because it requires trusting each other formally, and men out here have a complicated relationship with formal agreements. Pete Delaney would, he said slowly. We already have the water rights paper. Pete's the key, she said. If Pete's in, the Garner brothers will follow. They've worked with him for 20 years. Colt looked at her. And the January payment? That's a separate problem. I've been looking at options. She slid a second piece of paper across to him. The Delaney arrangement has a provision for shared maintenance costs on the creek access. If we formalize the cooperative before the 1st of January, there's a case to be made that the Delaney contribution toward shared infrastructure could offset part of what we owe. It's not conventional, but it's not dishonest either. He picked up the paper, read it, set it down. Did you just structure a legal argument out of a water rights arrangement? I structured it out of your existing water rights arrangement, she said. I just wrote down what was already true. He looked at her for a long moment, not the measuring look from October, not the careful assessment of a man deciding whether to trust a stranger. Something different, something that had been building for 2 months and had nowhere left to go except to be what it was. When did you come up with this? He said. I've been thinking about it since the Voss visit, she said. The fire made it clearer. The fact that Pete's men came without being asked, that's not just neighborliness. That's what a community that has a shared stake does. I just thought, what if we made the stake explicit? Graves isn't going to like it. Graves isn't supposed to like it. He was quiet for a moment, then, we'd need to call a meeting, get everyone together. I know, and someone would have to do most of the talking. It can't be me, not for the first conversation. They don't know me well enough yet. It'll have to be Pete, he said. If Pete stands up in front of Delaney and the Garners and Whitfield and says this makes sense, they'll hear it. Can you get Pete to the meeting? Yes. He said it with the certainty of a man who knows what a 12-year-old water arrangement and a grass fire fought side by side actually means between neighbors. Yes, I can get Pete. The meeting happened 4 days later on a Saturday in the Delaney barn because it was the largest space, and because Pete Delaney, once he'd heard the broad shape of the plan, had responded with the blunt enthusiasm of a man who has been waiting for someone to do the obvious thing for years. Graves has been picking at this valley since his father died and left him that bank, Pete said, the morning Colt rode over to explain. Evelyn had stayed at home. This part wasn't hers, but Colt told her every word of it that evening. About time someone drew a line. 5 ranches represented in Pete's barn on that Saturday. Brennan, Delaney, Garner, both brothers, which was notable because the Garner brothers rarely went anywhere together voluntarily, the Whitfield operation, and a smaller spread called the Aldrich place that Evelyn hadn't even known existed until Colt mentioned it, run by a widow named Frances Aldrich, who raised cattle and sheep on 120 acres east of the creek. Evelyn had written the framework document. Colt had reviewed it twice. Pete had read it once, said he didn't understand some of the language, and Colt had explained it, and Pete had said, well, if that's what it says, then that's all right. She stayed at the ranch with the children and waited. Thomas knew something was happening. He was 11 and observant, and the kind of child who noticed when adults were tense about something they weren't fully explaining. He sat through the afternoon with his rock collection organized and reorganized on the front porch, pretending to be occupied while watching the road. At 3 o'clock, he came into the kitchen. Is Papa going to lose the ranch? He asked. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the draft of the cooperative agreement, making notes on the final copy. She looked up at him. She thought about what to say, about the various ways you could soften something without lying, about what children needed to be protected from, versus what they needed to know. Then she thought about Thomas specifically. about the boy who had been carrying his grief like a private burden for over a year, who had learned not to ask for things because things had been so uncertain for so long. Not if we can help it, she said, and we're trying very hard to help it. He sat down across from her, looked at the paper. Is that what the meeting's about? He said. Yes. What does it do? She looked at him, really looked at him, the serious 11-year-old face, the dark eyes that were his father's. It ties this ranch to the other ranches in the valley in a way that makes it harder for anyone to take it from us, she said. Like, if you're standing alone and someone pushes you, you fall. But if you're standing linked with other people, it's a different situation. He thought about this with the thoroughness he brought to arithmetic. Like in a tug of war, he said. Exactly like that. He nodded. Then, you came up with this? Your father and I came up with it, she said, which was accurate in the sense that she'd brought the idea and he'd made it workable, and the line between those two things had blurred in the way that collaboration blurs things when it's going well. Thomas looked at the paper again. I'm glad you're here, he said. He said it the same way he said everything, flat and factual and without decoration. And then he got up and went back to his rock collection on the porch. And Evelyn sat at the table and held very still for a moment, because some things require a second to absorb before you can move past them. Colt came home at 5. The light was already gone, and the cold was the kind that came in through the walls, no matter what you did. And he came through the kitchen door with snow on his coat and something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not happiness exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has just managed to set it down. They signed, he said. She put down her pen. All of them, he said. Pete, both Garners, Whitfield, and Francis Aldrich. 6 ranches in a formal water cooperative. He reached into his coat and laid the signed document on the table, her framework, now with 6 signatures at the bottom, including his own. Pete gave a speech. It was about 4 sentences, and it was the best speech I've ever heard. What did he say? He said, Graves has been playing us against each other for 15 years because we let him. I'm tired of it, and I expect you are too. This paper says we stop letting him. That's all it is. And then he signed it. Evelyn looked at the signatures. Francis Aldrich's was small and careful. Pete Delaney's was enormous, the signature of a man who'd been signing things with complete confidence for 50 years. There's still the January payment, she said. Yes. He sat down. But I talked to Pete about the shared infrastructure arrangement. He's willing to make the contribution in December before the due date if we formalize the maintenance agreement as an addendum. She'd drafted that addendum 2 days ago. She pulled it from the folder and put it on top of the cooperative document without saying so. He looked at it, then at her. Then he laughed. A short, real sound. Nothing performed about it. The laugh of someone who has been surprised past their own defenses. You already wrote it, he said. I thought it might be useful. Evelyn. Yes? He looked at her across the table. All the papers between them, the lamp burning, the house quiet because the children had gone to bed and the ranch was settled for the night. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been trying to find the right words for something and has concluded that maybe there aren't the right words and maybe that's all right. Thank you, he said. Just that. She nodded. Get it to Pete before the 15th, she said. I'll write over Monday. Bye, Auntie. But the cooperative agreement and the addendum were not, as it turned out, the end of the crisis. They were the shape of a solution to a problem that had not yet finished becoming itself. The letter from Harlan Graves arrived on a Monday. It was addressed to Colt, and it was written in the careful, legally precise language of a man who had an attorney read everything before it went out, and what it said, under the courtesy and the procedural language, was this. Graves had become aware of the water cooperative agreement through what the letter called community discussion, which meant someone at the meeting had talked, and he was writing to inform Mr. Brennan that the cooperative arrangement, in his reading, constituted a material change in the use of the water resources that served as collateral in the existing property note, and as such he was requesting a meeting to discuss the implications for the existing lending arrangement. The implications for the existing lending arrangement. Evelyn read those words 3 times. He's claiming the cooperative changes the value of the collateral, she said. Colt was reading it again over her shoulder. Can he do that? The note's language would determine that. Do you have the original note document? He went to his desk and came back with it. She read through the collateral provisions while he stood and waited with the particular stillness of a man trying not to show how frightened he is. The language was broadly written, broad enough, a sympathetic reading might argue, to support Graves's position. Broad enough, an unsympathetic reading would argue the same way. "He's not calling the note," she said slowly. "He's requesting a meeting. There's a difference. A meeting to talk about calling the note. A meeting to talk about the implications." She set the document down. "That's not the same thing. He's fishing. He wants to know how solid we are before he decides whether to push. If he pushes and we're not solid, then we need to be solid by the meeting." She looked at him. "When is he proposing?" Colt pointed to the date in the letter. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, thinking through the shape of what they had and what they needed. The cooperative agreement, the Delaney addendum, the Hartwell feed contract showing operational continuity, the ranch accounts with their reduced but real margins, and the cooperative itself, 6 ranches now formally linked to the spring water on Brennan land, 6 families who now had a documented stake in what happened to this ranch. "We need an attorney," she said, "before the meeting." "There's no attorney in Black Hollow." "No, but there's one in Laramie, too, I think." She'd looked this up weeks ago for a different reason and hadn't needed the information until now. "If we send a letter Tuesday, we could have someone here by the weekend." "That costs money, It costs less than losing the ranch," she said. He stopped, breathed, nodded. "There's something else," she said. "There's more. The cooperative document." She picked it up. Graves' letter says he became aware of it through community discussion, which means someone at that meeting talked before the ink was dry. 6 ranches, 6 different people, and at least one of them is willing to carry word to Graves. She looked at him steadily. "You need to know which one." He was quiet for a long moment. This was the part that would hurt. The idea that one of the men who'd stood in Pete Delaney's barn and signed the paper had walked out and taken it straight to Graves. "The Garner brothers," he said finally. "The older one, Ben. He's had dealings with Graves's bank for years. Has a note on his equipment." "Leverage," she said. "Probably." "Does Pete know?" "Pete suspects. He told me as much on the ride out." Colt sat down. "Ben Garner's not a bad man. He's a frightened one." "Frightened men are the most dangerous kind," Evelyn said. "Not because they want to cause harm, because they make decisions based on what they're afraid of instead of what's actually true." Colt looked at her. "What do we do about it?" "We give Ben Garner something less frightening to hold on to than Graves's good opinion," she said. "Specifically, we make sure he understands that the cooperative protects his operation too. That if it fails, he loses whatever informal arrangement he's had on the creek, and Graves gets the spring water, and then Ben Garner has 2 problems instead of 1. He knows all that. He knows it intellectually. He needs to feel it." She paused. "Pete can do that. Pete's known him since before either of them had gray hair." Colt rubbed his face. "I'll talk to Pete tomorrow." "Today," she said. "The meeting is 2 weeks away and Pete needs time." He looked at her, and she saw in his face the thing she'd been seeing more of in recent weeks, the thing that had no clean name, but that was real and accumulating, and neither of them had addressed directly because the crisis had given them a convenient reason not to. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has started to depend on in ways he didn't plan for and doesn't know how to categorize. "Today," he agreed. She was alone in the house when Francis Aldrich came. Colt had ridden to the Delaney place. The children were at school. There was a school teacher in Black Hollow 3 days a week, and Evelyn had started sending both children consistently about 3 weeks in, which had required negotiations with Thomas that she preferred not to revisit. She was at the desk in the front room, working through the notes she was preparing for the attorney, when she heard the horse and came to the door. Frances Aldrich was maybe 50, with a weathered face and the posture of a woman who'd been making her own decisions for long enough that her body had stopped asking permission for anything. She came up to the porch and looked at Evelyn with frank, direct eyes. "I heard about the Graves letter," she said. "Word travels." "Apparently," Evelyn said. "Would you like to come in?" Frances came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the kitchen with the assessing gaze of someone who has run her own house for a long time and evaluates others by their kitchens. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. I want to know what we're doing, she said. Not what Colt's doing. What we, the cooperative, are doing about Graves trying to use the note to undo what we signed. Evelyn looked at her. We're getting an attorney to review the note language and advise on whether his reading of the collateral provisions has any basis. And if it does? Then we go to the meeting with 6 ranchers and an attorney and a water cooperative that is already operating and already documented, and we make it clear that any action against the Brennan note is an action against the infrastructure of the entire valley. Frances turned her coffee cup. He's got a lot of money. Money isn't the only thing that matters in this situation, Evelyn said. Reputation matters too. And a banker who forces 6 family operations off their water arrangements so he can buy a spring doesn't have a good reputation for long, even in a territory where there aren't many laws against it. Frances looked at her steadily. Who are you planning to tell? I've drafted a letter, Evelyn said, to the Territorial Land Office, to the Laramie newspaper, and to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, outlining the cooperative arrangement and the apparent attempt to challenge it through the banking relationship. Not accusatory, factual, just what's happened, in sequence, with dates. A silence. Frances set down her cup. You wrote all that. It's drafted. I wanted the attorney to look at it before it goes out. But you wrote it. Yes. Frances Aldrich looked at her for a long moment with those frank, direct eyes. Colt Brennan's a good man, she said, but he was drowning. He wasn't asking for help, Evelyn said. No, men out here don't. Frances stood. I'm glad he married someone who didn't wait to be asked. She picked up her coat. The letter to the Stock Growers Association. I want to sign it, if you'll allow it. Evelyn looked up at her. It would carry more weight with more signatures. Then get Pete Delaney to sign it too. And the Garners. Even Ben. Especially Ben. She buttoned her coat. I'll talk to Ben. Woman to woman is sometimes easier than man to man. After she left, Evelyn sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen and thought about what had just happened. A woman she'd met once had ridden out to offer her weight to a fight that wasn't technically hers to fight. No one had asked her. She'd come anyway. It was the same thing Evelyn had done 8 weeks ago when she'd grabbed a fire beater and run toward the south fence line. Nobody had asked. The situation had required it, and she'd been there. She went back to her notes. Colt. Pete Delaney came to the ranch that evening with Colt, and they sat at the kitchen table, all 3 of them, which had become the configuration for serious discussions, as natural as if it had always been the arrangement. And Pete told them about Ben Garner. He talked to Graves, Pete said. He said it without drama, the way you state a thing you'd hoped wasn't true, but had known probably was. Not with bad intention. Graves called in the equipment note, just temporarily, just to remind Ben it existed. And Ben went in to talk about it, and Graves asked about the cooperative, and Ben... He paused. Ben's got 3 kids and a wife with a bad hip, and he's 1 bad season away from losing his operation. I'm not making excuses. I'm explaining. Did you talk to him? Colt said. I did. Pete's big hands flat on the table. He knows what he did. He's not a man who didn't know what he was doing. He just decided his family came first. Another pause. I told him his family is better protected inside the cooperative than outside it, and that if he wants to stay in, the way he stays in is he signs that letter to the Stock Growers Association. Will he? Evelyn asked. Pete looked at her with the particular look he had for her. Not the way he looked at Colt, not the way he looked at his own ranch hands, but the look of an old man who has seen enough of the world to know when something is a better kind of thing than he'd expected. Frances Aldrich is talking to his wife tonight, he said. So yes, he'll sign. Colt looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. The attorney arrives Friday, she said. The meeting with Graves is the following Thursday. We have time to get this right. Graves is going to walk into that meeting expecting one man with a problem, Pete said. He's going to find something considerably different. Yes, Evelyn said. He is. Outside, the wind was up again, working at the windows with the dedication it had been applying since November, and the fire in the stove was doing its best and more or less winning, and in the front room Clara was teaching Thomas a card game she had apparently invented herself, and whose rules seemed to change based on who was winning. Their voices carried through the wall, Thomas's skeptical, Clara's cheerfully authoritative, and Evelyn listened to them, and Pete Delaney drank his coffee, and Colt looked at the table with the expression of a man who is sitting in the middle of something he built but didn't entirely plan, and finding that he doesn't entirely mind it. "Thursday," Colt said finally. "Thursday," Evelyn agreed. "I'm going to want you in that room," he said. It wasn't a question. "When we meet with Graves." She'd expected to have to argue for that. She looked at him for a moment, then looked at Pete, who was looking at his coffee with the expression of a man who has decided something is not his business but is pleased about it anyway. "All right," she said. "You know what you're doing," Colt said. "I'm not going in there without someone who knows what they're doing." "You know what you're doing," she said. "I know what I'm doing with cattle," he said. "That meeting isn't about cattle." He wasn't wrong about that. The meeting on Thursday wasn't going to be about cattle or land or water rights, not really. It was going to be about whether Harlan Graves could make one frightened family stand alone, and the answer to that question had been changing, quietly and steadily, for 8 weeks, one small decision at a time. The attorney arrived Friday as expected, a compact, serious man from Laramie named Aldous Merritt, who read the note language 4 times, reviewed the cooperative documents, read Evelyn's draft letters, and then looked up over his spectacles and said, "Graves's reading of the collateral provision is aggressive and not well supported. In my judgment, it would not survive a legal challenge." "In your judgment," Colt said. "In the judgment I'd be willing to put in writing and carry into a meeting," Merritt said, which was stronger than it sounded. That evening, after Merritt had gone to the room at the Black Hollow boarding house, Colt came and found Evelyn at her desk and stood in the doorway for a moment. "I want to ask you something," he said. She put down her pen. "How are you?" he said. "Not the ranch, not the meeting. You." She looked at him. It was the first time since she'd arrived that he'd asked that specific question in that specific way, separated out from everything practical, just aimed at her. She thought about it honestly. She was tired. She was more invested in this outcome than she'd known how to predict when she'd arrived in October. Her burned hand had healed, but the knuckles still caught sometimes in the cold. She had not written a single letter to anyone in Cincinnati because there was no one there she wanted to write to, and that was its own quiet kind of freedom. "I'm all right," she said. And then because he'd asked honestly and deserved an honest answer, "I think I'm where I'm supposed to be." He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then he said, "Get some sleep. Thursday's going to be a long day." "I know," she said. He went to bed. She sat at the desk for another hour, going over the documents one more time, because that was who she was. Someone who checked things twice, who didn't trust the first version of anything, who had learned a long time ago that the difference between prepared and unprepared was usually just the extra hour you put in when you were already tired. Thursday was 6 days away. The cooperative held 6 signatures. The attorney was on their side. Pete Delaney was on their side. Francis Aldrich was on their side. Ben Garner, frightened and guilty, and ultimately not a bad man, was on their side. And Harlan Graves was going to walk into a meeting expecting a drowning man and find a family instead. The morning of the Thursday meeting, Colt was up at 3:30. Evelyn heard him. The particular sound of someone trying not to make sound, which is always louder than sound made without that intention. She lay in her room for a few minutes listening to him move around downstairs, and then she got up and dressed and went down, because there was no version of this morning where she was going to sleep through it anyway. He was at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger and the cooperative documents and his coffee, not reading any of them. Just sitting with them spread in front of him the way a man sits with things he's been over too many times to need to read again. She made fresh coffee without comment and sat down across from him. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." He looked at the documents. "I keep thinking about what he's going to say. He's going to say the collateral provision is clear and he's entitled to review the note terms. Merritt will tell him the provision doesn't support that reading. He'll push. Merritt will hold. We'll put the cooperative documents and the letters on the table and he'll understand what he's actually looking at." She wrapped her hands around her cup. He's a practical man. Practical men don't fight battles they can see they're going to lose. "You sound very certain." "I'm not certain," she said. "I'm prepared. Those aren't the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind that had been their constant companion since November was doing its usual work. A log shifted in the stove. "What if it doesn't hold?" he said. Not as a plan B question. as the question underneath everything, the one that had been there since October when she'd first looked at the ledger and understood the shape of the trouble. What if Graves has an angle we haven't accounted for and the note gets called and we can't? Then we figure out what comes next, she said. I'm not going to tell you that can't happen because it can, but it's not what I think is going to happen. He looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the documents neither of them needed to read again. I wasn't looking for someone like you, he said. It came out plainly, the way things come out at 3:30 in the morning when the defenses are down. When I wrote that advertisement, I was looking for someone who could manage the house and be decent to my children. That was the whole of it. She said nothing. Let him finish. I didn't expect... He stopped, tried again. You've done more than I knew how to ask for, more than I had any right to expect from the arrangement. The arrangement, she said carefully, has been changing for a while. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. It has. They sat with that in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. Two people who had arrived at a door neither of them had originally intended to stand in front of and were now standing in front of it and not quite going through it, because this morning was not the morning for it, and they both knew that without saying so. After Thursday, he said finally. After Thursday, she agreed. He looked back at his coffee. She looked at hers, and they sat together in the early dark and waited for morning, which came eventually, the way mornings always do, regardless of what they're bringing with them. Harlan Graves's bank looked different on a Thursday with purpose behind you. Evelyn had been inside it once before, in October, the morning after the men had come to the ranch. That time she'd been a week in the territory and still finding her footing in a place that hadn't asked her here. This time she walked in beside Colt with Aldous Merritt on Colt's other side, and the full cooperative document set in the satchel she was carrying, and the building was the same building, but she was not the same person standing in it. Graves was waiting in his private office at the back. He was a man in his mid-50s with the particular build of someone who had been physically substantial once and had let the years redistribute it. He had a good suit and careful eyes, and the practiced pleasantness of a man who had used pleasantness as a tool for long enough that it had become his default expression regardless of what was happening behind it. He looked at Evelyn when they came in, and his pleasant expression registered the presence of Merritt and did a small recalibration. Mr. Brennan. A handshake. Then to Evelyn, Mrs. Brennan. Then with a fractional shift, and you've brought an attorney. Aldous Merritt Laramie, Merritt said, and they shook hands with the particular formality of men who have dealt with each other's profession long enough to know exactly how much warmth to allocate. They sat. Graves's office had a large desk and 3 chairs arranged in front of it, and a window behind him that put the light in visitors' eyes, which was either deliberate or coincidental, and either way she was going to ignore it. Graves opened with the pleasant version of what his letter had said: concern for clarity, mutual interest in the note terms, the cooperative arrangement raising questions he felt obligated to address. He was smooth about it. You had to give him that. He made concern sound like service. Merritt addressed the legal position first, which was correct, and what they'd planned. He laid out the collateral provision language, his reading of it, and the absence of precedent for Graves's interpretation in plain and accurate terms. Not aggressive, not conciliatory, just factual, in the way that facts are most effective when they're stated as if they don't need defending. Graves listened with the expression of a man who had expected this and had something ready for it. The cooperative arrangement, he said, changes the operating relationship to the water resource in ways that could affect future land value. That's not a legal position, it's a practical one. And practically, I have an obligation to the bank's stakeholders. Mr. Graves, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. She'd been silent until now, which had been the plan. Let Merritt establish the legal ground, then place the practical reality on the table. You have an obligation to your stakeholders, she said. I understand that. What I'd like to make sure you understand is what the practical situation actually is. She opened the satchel and placed the cooperative document on the desk in front of him. The original, all 6 signatures. Then the water rights agreement with Delaney. Then the Hartwell feed contract. Then the letter to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, signed by all 6 cooperative members including Ben Garner's signature, which was the one she watched Graves's eyes find. He looked at the documents. His pleasant expression stayed in place, but something behind it was doing a rapid and private recalculation. The spring water on Brennan land, she said, is now the documented center of a water cooperative serving 6 ranching operations in this valley. Those operations collectively represent approximately 900 head of cattle and 4,000 acres of productive land. The letter to the Stock Growers Association describes the cooperative arrangement and its importance to the valley's infrastructure. She paused. It goes out Friday, regardless of how this meeting concludes, as does the letter to the Territorial Land Office and the one to the Laramie paper. A silence. The pleasant expression on Graves's face was doing what pleasant expressions do when they've run out of usefulness. It was becoming something a little more tired. The note, Graves said, is still a note. It is, Colt said. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd sat down, and he said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration. And the note payments are current. The January payment will be made on time. You have no grounds to call it, and Merritt's told you so. He leaned forward slightly. What you have is a choice between being the bank that supports this valley's ranching operations or being the bank that tried to leverage a grieving man's debt into land acquisition and got stopped. Whichever one you are, people in this territory will know about it, because people here always know. Another silence. Longer. Graves looked at the documents again. Then he looked at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and she saw in his face the exact moment a man decides that the cost of continuing exceeds what he was ever going to gain from it. The note terms stand as written, he said. We have no further concerns about the collateral arrangement. He said it like a man announcing a decision he was making freely, which was the only face-saving version of it available to him, and she didn't take that away from him. They stood, shook hands, all of them, including her, and Graves's handshake with her was firm and brief and told her nothing except that he was a man who knew how to shake hands with someone who'd beaten him. Outside on the boardwalk in the December cold, Merritt said, "That was well done," and Colt said, "It was," and looked at Evelyn, and she looked at the street and breathed winter air and felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight since the day the Graves letter arrived. "Buy you a coffee, Merritt," Colt said. "I wouldn't object," Merritt said. They went to the lunch counter down the street, and Colt paid for the coffee and the pie, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world. 3 people at a counter after a hard morning, and the coffee was bad and the pie was good, and none of them said much because there wasn't much left to say. And that was its own kind of relief. It was Thomas who came undone that evening. Evelyn hadn't expected it, and later she thought she should have. Had seen enough of him by now to know that his silences had weight, that the things he didn't say collected until they became too heavy for the silence to hold. But he'd been so steady through everything, the stoic 11-year-old who asked direct questions and went back to his rocks and his arithmetic, that she hadn't tracked how much he'd been carrying underneath the steady. She found him in the barn at dusk, when she went to check on the horses before supper. He was sitting in the corner of one of the stalls with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up, and she almost didn't see him in the low light. He wasn't crying. Thomas didn't cry, or if he did, he made sure nobody saw it. But his face had the look of a face that had recently been doing something close to it. She sat down in the straw next to him without asking if he wanted company, because he would have said no, and that would have been the wrong answer. They sat for a moment. One of the horses shifted and blew. The barn had the smell of hay and animals and cold wood that she'd come to find oddly comforting over the past 2 months. "Are we going to be all right?" Thomas said. "Not is the ranch going to be all right. Yes," she said. "The meeting went well. The note's secure. The cooperative holds. We're going to be all right." He was quiet. Then, Mama died, and then everything started falling apart. The ranch and everything. He said it factually, but she could hear what was underneath it. "I thought if the ranch went, we'd have nothing left of her. She built things here. She planted things." He paused. "The kitchen garden. That's hers. She put that in the first year." Evelyn sat very still. The kitchen garden, that she'd been weeding and tending for 2 months, that she'd thought was a neglected space in need of reclaiming. She had not known, nobody had told her, that Margaret Brennan had put every plant in that ground herself. "Thomas," she said, "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't." He said it without accusation, which somehow made it harder. "I didn't say." "Why didn't you say?" He picked at the straw beside him. Because I thought if I told you it was hers, you'd leave it alone and it would keep going to weeds. And it was already going to weeds before you came. He looked at his hands. And I didn't want to talk about it. Any of it. Everything to do with her felt like if I talked about it, it would be more gone than it already was. She let that sit for a moment. Let it be what it was without rushing to fix it. She sounds like she was very capable, Evelyn said. Someone who planted a kitchen garden in the first year on a new homestead, who made curtains for the windows, who… She paused and then said carefully, who raised a son who knows how to be honest about hard things when he decides to. Thomas didn't say anything for a long moment. I don't think you're trying to replace her, he said. It came out like a concession he'd been working up to for a long time. I did at first, but I don't now. Good, she said. Because I'm not. I can't and I wouldn't try. She looked at the stall wall across from them. What I can do is be here. As whatever I am to you. You don't have to call it anything. It doesn't need a name right now. He was quiet again. Then he said, Clara calls you Mama sometimes, when she forgets. Evelyn had noticed, had not drawn attention to it. Does that bother you? A long pause. It used to, he said. It doesn't as much now. He looked at her sideways from the corner of his eye, the look of someone checking a thing they're not sure about. She doesn't remember as much as I do. She was only 4. That must be strange, Evelyn said, carrying memories that she doesn't have. Yeah. The word came out rough and young and utterly unlike the controlled 11-year-old he usually presented. Yeah, it is. They sat in the barn for another 10 minutes, not talking much, while the horses moved around them and the temperature outside dropped, and the smell of supper cooking began to drift in from the house. Eventually Thomas got up, brushed straw off his pants, and held out a hand to help her up, a small automatic gesture he probably didn't notice himself making. She took it, stood. Thank you, she said, for telling me about the garden. He shrugged with one shoulder. I'll tell you what other things were hers, he said. If you want, so you know. I'd like that, she said. He went ahead of her toward the house, and she followed, and she thought about the kitchen garden under snow, Margaret Brennan's kitchen garden planted in the first year, now tended through 2 months of autumn by a woman who hadn't known what she was tending. There was something in that worth sitting with. She didn't try to make it into anything more than what it was. Colt found her later that night. The house was quiet, children in bed, Merritt long gone back to Laramie with his fee and his good opinion of how the morning had gone. Colt had done the late check on the cattle and come in and found Evelyn at the kitchen table, not working, just sitting with her hands around a cup that had gone cold, which was unlike her. He sat down across from her. What happened? She told him about Thomas, the barn, the conversation, the kitchen garden. He listened with his elbows on the table and his hands folded and his face doing the thing it did when something was landing hard and he was deciding whether to let it show. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Margaret put that garden in the spring of our 2nd year, he said. She'd been trying to get something to grow since we arrived, and the first year everything failed because she didn't know the soil yet. 2nd year, she figured it out. He was looking at the table. She said if she could make things grow, she could stay. She stayed, Evelyn said. She stayed. He looked up. I think she would have… He stopped, tried again. She was not a woman who made friends with strangers easily. She was private and she could be hard, not unkind, but not soft either. He paused. I think she would have respected you. Evelyn felt something in her chest that was too complicated to name, a thing that had warmth in it and grief in it and recognition in it all at once. That means something to me, she said, more than you know. I thought it might. They sat in the kitchen in the late-night quiet, the fire burning down, and outside the wind had dropped for once, and the silence was the heavy silence of deep cold and snow, and the house settled around them with the sound that old houses make. Not distress, just the ordinary voice of wood and age and weather. There's something I haven't said, Colt said. She waited. I was wrong to not… When you first came, I had you in a category, arrangement, practical solution to a practical problem. He said it with the honesty of someone who has decided to say the true thing and is saying it the only way he knows, which is straight. I think I held on to that longer than was accurate because it was simpler. It meant I didn't have to figure out what was actually happening. What was actually happening? She asked. He looked at her directly. You were becoming part of this family, he said. Without asking permission, without making demands, you just kept showing up to everything. The fire, the cattle, the ledger, the meeting today. He paused. My son is talking to you in the barn at dusk about his mother. My daughter calls you Mama when she forgets to be careful. And He stopped. And you, she said. And I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement somewhere around the time you grabbed that fire beater and ran toward the south fence line, he said. I just didn't say so. She looked at him across the table, the man she had come to on a train from a city that had finished with her, to an arrangement that had finished being just an arrangement some weeks back without either of them marking the exact moment. We probably should have said so, she said. Probably. His mouth moved, close to a smile. I'm not good at saying things in the moment. I've noticed. He stopped. Is this all right? What this has become? For you. She thought about all right, about what she'd told him that night he'd asked how she was. I think I'm where I'm supposed to be. About the kitchen garden under snow, and a child's hand held out to help her up, and a man at 3:30 in the morning sitting with his ledger because he was too scared to sleep. Yes, she said. It's all right. And then, because the hour was late and she'd never been good at leaving important things half said, more than all right. Yes, Colt. It's good. He nodded. The word good from him, when he meant it, was substantial. When she said it back, she meant it to land the same way. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. Just his hand over hers on the table, the simple, straightforward gesture of a man who is not good with words and knows it and is offering what he can instead. She turned her hand and held his. They sat like that for a while in the kitchen while the fire finished burning down and the house held itself together around them the way it had been doing, imperfectly and stubbornly, through all the hard months of the year. The days after the Graves meeting had a different quality. Not easier, exactly. The work was the same work. Cattle to manage, feed to track, a fence line that Dick said needed serious attention before spring, and the account books that required weekly updating to stay ahead of any new surprises. The winter didn't ease up because they'd had a good Thursday. The north wind had no opinion about water cooperatives, but the weight had shifted. Evelyn noticed it in small ways, the way you notice a change in weather not by any single sign, but by everything at once feeling marginally different. Colt came to the kitchen table in the evenings now, without the ranch ledger unless there was something specific to work through. He asked her about her day, which sounds like a small thing, and was not. He told her things about the land, the history of it, the seasons he remembered, the year the spring flooded and the year the drought nearly broke everything, in the unhurried way of someone who has decided a person is worth the telling. Thomas began to tell her the things. He did it one at a time, spread across the following 2 weeks, in the offhand manner he brought to everything that mattered to him. Walking past the mantel. Those candlesticks were a wedding gift. She brought them from her parents' house, helping carry firewood. She stacked it this way, said it dried better. At the kitchen table one afternoon, pointing to the window, she liked to watch the hawks from there, said they were better than reading. Each one was a small offering. A door opened a careful inch. Evelyn received each one the same way, with attention and without making too much of it, because Thomas would close a door faster than he opened one if he felt it was being made into something ceremonial. Clara, for her part, had stopped being careful about the word mama. She used it the way she used everything, freely, practically, without self-consciousness. One evening she looked up from her drawing and said, "Mama, is it true that in spring we can plant beans in the garden?" And Evelyn said yes, and Clara went back to her drawing, and Thomas, sitting across the table, said nothing. But he did not correct her, and that was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. There was an evening in the 3rd week of December that Evelyn would hold on to for a long time. It was a cold night, the coldest yet, and they'd pushed the kitchen chairs closer to the stove, and Clara had fallen asleep against Colt's arm midway through the book he was reading to her, and he'd kept reading in a low voice so she didn't wake. And Thomas was across the table doing his geography work with the focused energy he'd started bringing to it since Evelyn had tied it to the things he already knew about terrain, and Evelyn was mending a shirt at the other end of the table. It was ordinary. Entirely ordinary, the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as important while it's happening, and only later takes on its full weight in memory. 4 people in a warm kitchen on a cold night, each occupied with something specific, the silence between them the comfortable kind that doesn't need filling. Thomas looked up at one point and looked around the table at all of them, taking inventory the way he did, and then he went back to his geography. That was all. But Evelyn had seen his face in that second, and what was on it was something she recognized because she'd felt it herself in the last few weeks. The particular look of someone who has been afraid of something for a long time and has recently and tentatively stopped being afraid of it. Not because the fear was wrong. The fear had been right. Things did go wrong. Things did change. People did leave, and the ones who stayed sometimes did damage in their staying. The fear had been earned. But so was this. The warmth and the lamp and the low voice reading and the child asleep and the ordinary evening. This had been earned too, through weeks of hard work and harder honesty and the small daily decision to keep showing up. Colt finished the chapter and looked down at Clara and then at Evelyn, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying, so neither of them said it. Thomas closed his geography primer and stacked it neatly. "I'm going to bed," he said. He stood, and then, not looking at her, looking at the table, in the manner of Thomas Brennan making a gesture he hadn't fully decided to make until he was already making it, he said, "Good night, not good night, Evelyn, not good night, Mrs. Brennan, just good night, to the room, to whoever was in it." "Good night, Thomas," Evelyn said. He went upstairs. Colt carried Clara up shortly after, and Evelyn sat in the kitchen alone for a few minutes, listening to the house settle around her. This house that had been a stranger's house 10 weeks ago and had become, in the way that happens too slowly to mark but too thoroughly to deny, her own. She banked the fire, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs to bed in a home that was hers, in a life she had built from next to nothing, in a place that had not asked for her and had needed her anyway, and had, in its difficult and imperfect and thoroughly real way, become where she belonged. Winter finished its business with the Brennan Ranch slowly, the way winter always does in Wyoming. Not by leaving, but by loosening its grip 1 degree at a time, so gradually that you didn't notice it until one morning you stepped outside and the air had a different quality to it, something that wasn't warmth exactly, but was the memory of warmth returning. That morning came in the second week of March. Evelyn noticed it at the kitchen window while the coffee was heating, the particular pale light that came over the eastern hills differently than it had for months, and she stood looking at it for longer than she'd intended. The kitchen garden under the window was still covered, the ground still hard, but around the edges of the fence posts the snow had pulled back slightly to show a thin line of dark earth. It was not much, but it was something. She was still at the window when Colt came in from the early check, stomping snow off his boots at the door. "Ground's starting to turn," he said. "South-facing slope on the lower pasture. I saw the edge of the garden." He came to stand beside her at the window and looked at what she was looking at. "Another 3 weeks, maybe 4. I want to put in potatoes early this year," she said. "Thomas told me Margaret had a way of starting them under straw while the ground was still cold. Said they came up stronger." He looked at her sideways. "He told you that?" "2 weeks ago. He's been telling me things as he thinks of them." She poured 2 cups and handed him one. "I've been writing them down." Colt looked at her with an expression she'd come to know well over the past 5 months. The expression of a man being surprised by something he probably should have seen coming. He took the coffee and didn't say anything for a moment, which was his version of being moved. "She would have liked that," he said, "that you're writing them down." Evelyn nodded and didn't make more of it, because it didn't need more. Some things were best received quietly and held. The January note payment had gone out on time. She had stood at the kitchen table and watched Colt seal the envelope and had felt something she recognized from her father's business. Not triumph, because triumph implies something was overcome cleanly, and nothing here had been overcome cleanly, but the steadier satisfaction of a thing done right through the right kind of effort. It wasn't the payment itself. It was the 6 signatures on the cooperative document and the Hartwell contract and the Delaney addendum and the 2 months of careful daily work that had made the payment possible when it shouldn't have been. Graves had processed it without comment. She'd been watching for some secondary move, some other angle she hadn't accounted for, and there hadn't been one. Not in January and not in February. Either the meeting had been as definitive as it felt, or Graves was patient in a way that would eventually produce something unexpected. And she'd concluded that worrying about which one it was used energy better spent on things she could actually affect. Pete Delaney had told Colt in late January that word of the cooperative had gotten around to ranches as far as 30 miles out. 3 operations had sent letters asking about joining. She'd drafted the response, welcoming in principle, with the terms the existing members had agreed on, and Pete had signed it as the cooperative's de facto elder and sent it out. And by February, there were 8 signatures where there had been 6. And the thing they'd built in desperation had become something people wanted to be part of by choice. Francis Aldrich came to the ranch for supper in February, the first social visit that hadn't been about crisis management, and she and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table after dinner while Colt took the children out to look at something Dix had found in the barn. A cat with a new litter, discovered in the hay, and Francis said, "You know what you've done here, don't you?" "I helped," Evelyn said. Francis made a sound that was dismissive in the particular way of a woman who has lived long enough to know the difference between helping and leading. "You organized people who had never been organized. In a valley where everyone was competing quietly with everyone else, you drew a circle and put them all inside it." She turned her coffee cup. "That's not a small thing. It was Colt's land and Pete's reputation and your signature on the letter to the Stock Growers Association," Evelyn said. "I just wrote it down." "You always say that," Francis said, "that you just wrote it down, as if the writing down is nothing." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I've spent a long time making myself useful in ways that were easy to minimize. It's a hard habit to break." Francis looked at her steadily. "Break it," she said. "This valley could use someone who knows how to write things down." Spring came in stages, each one slightly better than the last, the way good things tend to arrive on the frontier, earned and incremental and more valuable for it. The kitchen garden went in during the 3rd week of March. Thomas had appointed himself the authority on what went where. Based on accumulated knowledge, he delivered with the precision of an 11-year-old who has decided this is his domain. Evelyn followed his directions without debate, because they were good directions, and because there was something in watching him walk the rows of turned earth with his father's purposeful stride, pointing out where the beans had gone, and where the squash had sprawled, and where Margaret Brennan had once coaxed things out of difficult ground, that was worth more than being right about the layout. Clara planted her own section. She had been given a corner, genuinely her corner, nothing diplomatic about it, and she planted it with the vegetables she had personally researched over the winter by badgering Evelyn about what grew well and what didn't and why. "Carrots and radishes," she told Evelyn, on her knees in the dirt with complete seriousness. "Radishes come up fast so you know the ground is working. Then the carrots come after." "Who taught you that?" Clara looked up with an expression that said this was obvious. "You told me, in November, when we were looking at the seed catalog." Evelyn had said that. She hadn't remembered saying it. It struck her, not for the first time, that children absorb everything. Every idle comment, every piece of information dropped in passing, and that what you say around them matters in ways you don't always track in the moment. The calf crop that spring was better. Not extraordinary, not the kind of season that erases previous troubles in a single go, but solid. 42 calves from the herd, healthy and mostly without incident, which, after the previous spring's losses, felt like something to hold on to. Dix came in on a Tuesday morning in April with the look of a man delivering news he's pleased about, and told them the final count, and Colt sat with it for a moment, and then looked at Evelyn across the kitchen, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything because the number said it well enough. The financial picture through spring was the picture of a ranch that had stopped sliding. Not recovered? Recovery was a longer arc than 5 months, but stabilized, which was the first requirement before anything else was possible. She updated the ledger weekly, and the trend lines moved in the right direction, and she didn't celebrate it because celebration was for when you were on solid ground, and solid ground was still a season or 2 away. But she noted it in the way she noted all the real things. Quietly, with attention, and with some private satisfaction, she didn't need to perform for anyone. The townspeople of Black Hollow had their own timeline for forming opinions about Evelyn Mercer Brennan, and it moved at the pace of a small community in a territory where winters were long and people had time to observe and discuss. Mrs. Prentice at the general store, who had told her daughter that Evelyn wouldn't last out the winter, revised this opinion sometime in February. She didn't announce the revision, but she began to add small extras to the Brennan order without charging for them. A tin of something, a length of ribbon for Clara, which was the local currency of approval, and Evelyn understood it as such. The men who worked neighboring operations had made up their minds at the cooperative meeting and confirmed it through the spring. She was the one who had drafted the thing. Everyone seemed to know this. And in a valley of people who dealt in practical value, drafting a document that worked was worth more than a year of social niceties. There was a community gathering in May at the Delaney barn again, because Pete Delaney's barn was apparently the valley's default venue for anything that required bringing more than 10 people together. It was ostensibly a celebration of the cooperative's first official season, which Pete had declared with the authority of a man who knew a good excuse for a gathering when he saw one. There was food, and there was music from a fiddle player who came from somewhere east of the valley, and there were children running between the adult legs with the complete indifference to livestock and dignity that children in barns always demonstrate. Evelyn stood near this barn door at one point, watching Clara chase a small boy across the hay-strewn floor with the focused intensity she brought to all physical endeavors. And Pete Delaney came and stood beside her with his big hands in his coat pockets and his white hair bright in the lamplight. "You look different than October," he said. "I feel different," she said. "Should." He watched the children for a moment. "You know what I thought when Colt said he was getting a mail-order bride? After everything he'd been through?" "I can guess." "Probably not exactly." He glanced at her. "I thought, that poor woman. Coming out here to a broken-down ranch, and a man who doesn't know how to ask for help, and 2 children who are going to make her life hard." He paused. "I felt sorry for you, before I'd met you. And now?" He considered it with the deliberateness he brought to everything. "Now I think you got exactly what you came for," he said, "even if neither of you knew what that was when you started." She thought about that. About a boarding house room in Cincinnati and a magazine advertisement and a letter she'd written on a Tuesday afternoon because she'd looked out the window at a brick wall and decided that waiting for something to happen to her was not a strategy she was willing to continue. About a train platform in October and a man with his hat in his hands, and 2 children who were the whole story of everything she was going to have to earn. "I didn't know what I came for," she said. "That's true. Do you now?" She looked across the barn. At Clara, still running. At Thomas standing with 2 boys his age looking at something in his hand, probably a rock. At Colt on the other side of the barn talking to the Garner brothers with the ease of a man who has stopped managing his relationships from behind a wall of polite distance. "Yes," she said. Pete made a satisfied sound and went to get more coffee, which was entirely Pete Delaney. There was an evening in late May that became, in Evelyn's private accounting, the moment she understood what the past 7 months had actually been about. It was after supper, the dishes done, the kitchen settling into the particular quiet of a weekday evening when everyone has found their place. Clara was on the settle with a picture book, doing the thing she did where she read it out loud to herself very quietly, a murmur of narration she wasn't aware she was producing. Thomas was at the desk in the corner with his geography primer and a new book she'd gotten him from the Laramie Lending Library. A naturalist's guide to the Wyoming Territory, with illustrations of rock formations and bird species, which had been an immediate and profound success. Colt was on the porch. She could hear the occasional sound of the rocking chair. She went out. The evening was warm for the first time. Genuinely warm. The kind that felt like a promise being kept. And the sky over the western hills was doing something complicated with orange and purple that she'd been watching for weeks and still hadn't gotten used to. The ranch in evening light looked the way the ranch in October had suggested it might if things went right. The corral solid, the kitchen garden green and organized, the outbuildings with doors that hung correctly, because Colt had rehung them in April when the mud dried and there was finally time. It was not a perfect ranch. It was a working ranch, which meant it was in a constant negotiation between what it was trying to be and what the land and weather and market would permit. There would be more bad seasons. There would be more things going wrong at the same time in the way that things did out here, without warning and without apology. The note was still the note. The margins were still what they were. None of that was resolved. She didn't believe in resolved. She sat down in the other chair and looked at the hills, and Colt rocked slowly, and the evening settled around them. Thomas showed me where he keeps his rock collection, she said. He's got it organized by where on the property he found them. He's been doing it since he was 8. I know, Colt said. Margaret started it with him. She liked rocks, said they were the honest thing. They didn't pretend to be something they weren't. Evelyn smiled at the hills. That tracks. He was quiet for a moment, then, I want to ask you something. She waited. You came here on an arrangement, he said. That's how it started. And it's become what it's become. But the arrangement was we never made it into something permanent, on paper. She looked at him. He was looking at the middle distance, the way he looked when he was saying the hard thing and wasn't sure of the landing. We're married, she said. That's on paper. That's a contract, he said. That's not what I'm asking. She understood what he was asking. He was asking whether she was staying because the contract said she was, or because she'd chosen to, and he was asking it 7 months late, which was also very Colt Brennan, waiting until he was sure the answer mattered before asking for it. I'm staying because I want to, she said. That's been true for a while. He nodded. The rocking chair moved. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said everything important, plainly, without dress, the way you state a fact you've verified and are confident in. I don't say things like that easily, so I want you to know I mean it the way it sounds. She looked at him. The man with the hat in his hands on a cold October platform. The man at 3:30 in the morning with his ledger and his fear. The man who had held her burned hand with both of his, and the man who had put his hand over hers at a kitchen table in December and not needed words for it. I know you mean it the way it sounds, she said. That's one of the things Yes, I love you too. She said it with the same plainness, because that was the only register that fit between them, and she wouldn't have had it different. I didn't come here expecting that. Neither did I, he said. Here we are anyway. Here we are. The porch was quiet. Inside, Clara's murmur of self-directed narration drifted through the window, and from the corner they could hear the faint sound of Thomas turning a page, and the evening held all of it. The ordinary sounds of a household that had become a family, not by declaration or sentiment, but by the slow accumulation of daily choices made in the same direction. There is something the frontier teaches you that you can't learn from a book or a finished story, which is that belonging is not a place you arrive at. It's not a moment where everything clicks into place and the before and after are clearly divided. It's built, the same way the ranch was built, board by board, season by season, through work done when you didn't feel like it and trust extended when you weren't sure it was safe, and a choice made each morning to keep going rather than find a reason to stop. Evelyn Mercer had come to Black Hollow with 2 hands, a bookkeeper's mind, and the stubborn inability to wait for someone else to fix things. She had not come with a plan for falling in love with a broken family on a failing ranch at the edge of the American frontier. She had not come planning to save anything. She had come looking for ground to stand on, and she had found, in the doing of all the ordinary and extraordinary things that standing on ground requires, that ground had a tendency to become home if you worked it long enough and cared about it honestly enough and stayed through the seasons that tried to push you out. That was not a lesson she'd been taught. It was one she'd had to live. There are people who will tell you that the test of a person is what they do when things are easy. This is wrong. Easy reveals nothing. The test is what you do when the ledger is short and the cattle are sick and the man next to you doesn't know how to ask for help and the child at the top of the stairs has decided in advance that you're the enemy. The test is whether you pick up the fire beater or whether you stand in the kitchen garden watching the smoke. Whether you write the letter or wait for someone else to write it. Whether you sit in a cold barn with a grieving 11-year-old or go back to the house because it isn't technically your problem. Evelyn had picked up the beater every time. Not because she was exceptional, because the situation required it, and she was there and capable, and it was the thing to do. That was all. It was always all. The gap between the person who changes things and the person who watches things change is rarely talent or courage in the dramatic sense. It's usually just the willingness to act on what you already know is right without waiting for permission or certainty or the moment to feel less frightening. She had not saved this Brennan ranch by herself. She had thought alongside Colt and worked alongside Pete Delaney and leaned on Francis Aldrich and trusted Thomas with the truth and let Clara grow toward her at her own pace. The saving had been collective, as it always is when anything real is saved. She'd just been the one who showed up to do the part that was in front of her, every time, without exception. The kitchen garden was already producing by mid-June. The radishes came up first, exactly as Clara had predicted, and Clara was insufferable about this in the best possible way, pointing them out to everyone, including the horses, in one memorable morning, as evidence of her superior agricultural judgment. The carrots followed, then the beans climbing their stakes, then the squash running along the fence in the way squash does, with what seemed like personal ambition. Thomas watched the garden the way he watched most things he cared about, apparently casually, actually with complete attention. He told Evelyn one morning that the bean stakes needed moving 6 inches south because the fence shadow was going to fall wrong as the summer progressed. He was right, and she moved them, and they argued briefly about the squash placement and reached a compromise. And it was the most natural argument in the world, the kind that happens between people who are both invested in the same outcome and have different information about how to get there. Afterward, walking back to the house, Thomas said, "She would have liked arguing about the garden." Evelyn glanced at him. "Mama," he said, "she liked having reasons." A pause. "She always said a person who doesn't argue about something doesn't care about it." "She was right about that," Evelyn said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back inside, and Evelyn stood for a moment in the kitchen garden that Margaret Brennan had planted and that she was tending and that Thomas was now superintending with the same care his mother had put into starting it. And she thought about what it meant to carry something forward. Not intact, not unchanged, but genuinely forward, altered by the carrying but not diminished by it. That was what family actually was, she thought, not the original thing preserved, the living thing continuing. The cooperative held its second full meeting in July, in Pete Delaney's barn again, with 10-member ranches now and a formal election of a 3-person council to manage the shared decisions going forward. Pete was elected unanimously as the first chair, which surprised no one, including Pete. Francis Aldrich was elected to the council, which surprised only the people who hadn't been paying attention. The third seat went to Colt, who accepted it with the expression of a man who had not sought the role and was going to take it seriously anyway. Evelyn sat in the second row at the meeting, between Clara and Thomas, and watched this happen. After, Ben Garner found her near the barn door. He was a big man with an uncomfortable face, the face of someone who has been living with something for a while and hasn't found a way to set it down. "I owe you an apology," he said. "What I did, talking to Graves before the ink was dry. I know what it could have—" "You were trying to protect your family," she said. "That's not—" "It doesn't excuse it," she said. "But I understand it, and you signed the letter to the Stock Growers Association when it mattered. That's what you did with the next choice you had." She looked at him steadily. "That's how it works. You don't get to undo the bad choice. You get to make a better one next time." He held her gaze for a moment, looking for something, absolution, maybe, or judgment, and getting neither, just the plain statement of how things were. "All right," he said finally, "all right," and walked away with some of the discomfort gone from his face, not all of it, which was about right. Clara found Evelyn's hand in the crowd and held it without ceremony, the way she did everything, matter-of-factly, without making it an event. Thomas appeared on her other side, having extracted himself from a conversation with Pete Delaney's youngest grandson that seemed to have been about rocks. "Can we go home?" he said. "Not impatiently, just ready." "Yes," Evelyn said. They found Colt at the wagon, and the 4 of them drove back to the ranch in the July evening, with the hills going golden around them, and the air smelling of summer grass, and somewhere behind them, Pete Delaney's barn and its lamplight, and the sound of people who had decided to stop competing with each other and start holding each other up. The road home was the same road it had always been. Ruts in the same places, the same bend where the Brennan Ranch came into view around the cottonwoods. The house with its mended porch railing and its straight-hung doors. The kitchen garden visible from the road now because things were growing in it properly. The outbuildings solid against the hill. Clara fell asleep against Evelyn's arm somewhere after the Harker Creek crossing, and Evelyn let her stay there, and Thomas rode with his eyes on the hills the way he did when he was thinking about something he hadn't named yet. And Colt drove with the easy competence of a man on a road he knew, and the evening came down around them unhurried and complete. This is the truth about the frontier and about most of the places people build their lives. It does not reward the person who arrived the most prepared or the most certain or the most equipped. It rewards the person who stayed, who got up the morning after the fire, and the morning after the meeting that almost went wrong, and the morning after the hardest conversation, and did the next thing that needed doing. Who found, in the doing of those things, that the place had changed around them, and they had changed inside it, and that the two changes together made something that neither one alone could have been. Evelyn Mercer had come to Black Hollow looking for a place to belong. She had found, in the end, that belonging was not a place at all. It was the thing you built, day after day, with the people you chose to build it with, out of the materials in front of you, imperfect materials, imperfect people, imperfect days, into something that could hold weight, something that could hold a family through the winters that were always coming. She had built it. They had built it. And now, coming down the road toward home in the July evening with her daughter asleep against her arm and her son watching the hills, and her husband's hands easy on the reins, she knew it would hold. Not because nothing else would go wrong. Everything was still capable of going wrong, and some of it would. But because they had learned, the four of them, through 7 months of fire and cold and fear and stubbornness and the slow, unannounced arrival of love, that going wrong was not the end of things. It was just the thing that happened before you figured out what to do next. And she would be here. She had chosen it, and she would choose it again tomorrow. And that was what it meant to be home.